Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Well, not that different really, because most of these stories involve a fair amount of doom, but this one, it's pastoral. Tonight we're travelling back to an era where showers didn't exist, toilets were literal wooden boxes, and shampoo was something you'd associate with witchcraft if you heard of it at all. Yep, you're heading straight into the Middle Ages. About 1,000 years of mud, plague, body odour, and people wondering if demons lived in their armpits. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and the time you're watching this down in the comments. I love knowing where and when my fellow night owls are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, imagine waking up in a room made entirely of timber and stone. There's no glass in the window, just wooden shutters, a single candle flickers in the corner, and something smells ripe. That something is you. You slept in the same shirt you've worn all week, and the rushes on the floor beneath you. Yeah, they're covering up months of crumbs, spit, and things better left unnamed. You're in a 14th century English village, and you've got business to handle, surviving another day without the concept of hygiene. Now, let's get something straight. People weren't clueless. They knew dirt was uncomfortable, and sometimes even unlucky, but they didn't have the germ theory. The word bacteria wouldn't show up in their vocabulary for centuries. What they did have was the deeply rooted belief that bad smells were dangerous. You didn't scrub the filth off because it was gross. You covered it up or avoided it because you thought the stench might kill you, which is adorably misguided. Still, medieval life wasn't just one long roll through a mud puddle. There were levels. Nobles had access to basins, perfumed oils and linen towels. Peasants had rivers, spit and the occasional community bucket. But even in castles, hygiene wasn't something you practiced. It was something you reacted to. If you got too itchy, then you looked for lice. If your teeth hurt, then you yanked them. And if you got a fever, you definitely blamed it on the stars, not the rat licking your spoon. Historical fact of the night. By the late Middle Ages, cities like London and Paris had some early waste systems. Not good ones, but better than nothing. In London, they dug massive trenches outside the city walls called lay stalls, which were basically legal dumping grounds. These were managed by rakers, the original sanitation workers, who carted off manure and garbage. Occasionally, maybe, when it didn't rain. And when it did, your waste just floated back into town. Quirky detail? Medieval people believed that being too clean could open your body to illness. Seriously. A hot bath was thought to soften the skin and widen the pores, which in their minds let disease sneak in like a burglar in the night. It's like being afraid of locking your doors too well. Some physicians even recommended rubbing yourself with oil instead of washing, because oil sealed the skin. You'd basically be marinating in your own funk, but at least the demons couldn't get in. Now here's a spicy little scholarly debate to fall asleep to. Were medieval people really as dirty as we think? Some researchers argue that the whole filthy peasant image comes more from Renaissance-era snobbery than historical truth. There are records of people owning combs, washing hands before meals, and even using soap made from animal fat and ash. Others say, yeah, maybe a few townsfolk tried, but most people just lived in a cycle of ignore it until it itches. Honestly, it's probably both. Think of it like modern flossing. Some people do it, some people lie about doing it, and most forget until something hurts. Anyway, let's talk about what's going on inside your lovely medieval home. You're a commoner, so you've got one room for everything: sleeping, cooking, storing firewood, and raising small children. The floor is packed earth, maybe scattered with straw or herbs like lavender to mask the smell of livestock and sweaty humans. You sleep under a wool blanket, scratchy and damp. It's August, so your skin is sticky, and there's an odd smell clinging to your armpits that you've decided to just name and live with. Outside, there's a trench that functions as the neighbourhood's drainage system. It's meant for rainwater, but it also catches dishwater, animal blood from the butcher, and things you definitely hope are not human. Dogs and pigs wander around in this slot because pigs, let's face it, are medieval garbage disposals with hooves. Kids play near it. You occasionally toss a pot of something unpleasant into it and move on with your life. And yet somehow you're alive. Sort of. There's a strange resilience in this world. Your immune system has been trained by brutal exposure. You drank from a stream upstream of the tanners. You ate bread made in an oven with questionable rats lurking nearby. You survived chickenpox in infancy, lice in adolescence, and a suspicious rash that cleared up after a cold winter. Your neighbour wasn't so lucky. or your uncle, or the local priest, but you're still here, and you haven't even taken a bath this month. There's something oddly comforting about it. Not the filth, but the fact that even in the absence of science, plumbing, or Purell, people manage to build cathedrals, write poetry, fall in love, raise children, and laugh over bad jokes while swatting flies. Humanity, despite the odds, didn't just survive, it thrived. In its own smelly, flea-ridden, deeply concerning way. But before you get too cozy in your straw mattress of horror, remember, tonight's just getting started. We haven't even touched on what passed for a bath, or how people dealt with things like open wounds, toothaches, or the great little rebellion of your scalp. You wake up groggy and sore, still nestled in that scratchy wool blanket that smells like sheep and regret. The sun is peeking through the crooked wooden slats of your shutters, and the first thing that hits you hard is the scent. It's you again. A powerful bouquet of sour sweat, stale ale, and something musky that might just be your feet. Bath time? Not likely. Not today. Not unless it's a holy day, not unless someone died, not unless you're planning to sin in the bathhouse. Welcome to the medieval relationship with bathing, highly irregular, vaguely suspicious, and sometimes downright taboo. You see, back in the day, a full-body soak wasn't considered the health-boosting, stress-melting ritual we romanticize now. A hot bath was something that made people a little nervous. There's this widely held belief that heat and moisture opened your skin to invisible dangers, miasmas, evil vapours, wicked humours that floated through the air looking for open pores to invade. Medieval physicians weren't exactly encouraging people to go scrub themselves raw. In fact, many of them warned against bathing too frequently. It wasn't seen as luxurious, it was seen as risky. Now, to be fair, that didn't mean no one bathed. The Romans had left behind a legacy of public bathhouses, and many European cities actually kept the tradition alive well into the Middle Ages. In places like Paris and London, you could go to a stew, a bathhouse often run privately by entrepreneurs who provided hot water, towels, and a space to stew your troubles away. But here's the thing, those stews slowly turned into not just cleaning houses, but pleasure houses. By the 14th century, the word bathhouse was almost synonymous with place where stuff happens that we can't talk about in front of grandma. This led the church to clutch its collective pearls. Bathhouses were eventually condemned, closed, or regulated into oblivion, not because they were unsanitary, but because they were too tempting. You might go in to rinse off the week's grime and end up naked with a stranger and a pitcher of mead. The horror. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, bathing was even rarer. You might splash water on your face in the morning, maybe wash your hands before meals if you were lucky enough to have access to clean water. But a full-body soak? That was a big deal. It required time, firewood to heat the water, someone to fill and dump the tub, and then, of course, someone to haul it all back outside when you were done. Tubs were often shared among family members, in descending order of social importance, and you, if you're not the lord of the manor, are probably last in line. The water is lukewarm, grey, and slightly oily by the time you get in. Enjoy. Fun historical fact? Bathing did have a bit of a golden moment during certain medieval periods. Charlemagne himself reportedly loved a good soak and often bathed with his friends and nobles. Monasteries sometimes included structured bathing schedules, though not necessarily for cleanliness, but more as a way to practice discipline and humility. Still, these were exceptions. For most people, bath time was once or twice a year max, usually around major holidays, like Christmas or Easter, to be clean for Jesus. Now here's your odd little fringe fact. Some people believed that wearing clean underwear was a better solution than washing your body. This gave rise to what we now call the shift method. Basically, you wear a clean linen shift, the undergarment closest to your skin, which supposedly absorbs all the sweat and grease. Then you change that instead of washing yourself. Linen was seen as magical for its absorbent and cooling properties, so people placed a lot of faith in it. To be fair, it probably did help a little. You still smelled like a campfire that rolled through a barn, but maybe slightly less so. Of course, scholars still argue about just how often medieval people bathed. Some records from 13th century England show that nobles maintained private baths and even had designated bath servants. In cities, bathhouses weren't just popular, they were busy enough to require scheduling. It's possible the decline in bathing had more to do with disease outbreaks and the church's shifting moral priorities than with any laziness. After the Black Death, for instance, many bathhouses were shuttered because of fear that warm water might spread the plague. That's right, plague shut down the spas. You, however, are not a noble. You're a common villager. And today your options are grim. You could take a quick rinse in the freezing stream that runs outside town, but it's been used by the butcher, the tanner, and 3 cows since sunrise. You could try boiling water over the hearth and pouring it into a wooden wash tub, but that would require several hours and probably the cooperation of your entire family. Or, and this is the most likely outcome, you just throw on another layer of clothing and go about your day, maybe rubbing your neck with a sprig of rosemary and calling it good. There's an upside to all this filth, weirdly enough. People's bodies were different back then. Not biologically, of course, you're still you, but your skin is tougher, your nose less sensitive, your immune system borderline superhuman from all the exposure. You don't expect to smell like rosewater. You expect to smell like a person who lives with pigs. And that normalization of grime, it gets you through. But let's not get too romantic about it. This level of unwashed living leads to problems. Skin infections were common, so were lice, scabies and rashes. Open wounds festered, boils formed, and yet people still survived. Not comfortably, not cleanly, but somehow through sheer stubbornness and microbial tolerance they made it work. And if you're wondering whether anyone missed being clean, probably not. You don't miss what you've never really had. A good breeze, a cool stream, the feel of linen against your skin, that's about as fresh as it gets. Anything more than that, that's for the nobility or the saints. So next time you're dragging yourself into the shower after a long day and grumbling about the water pressure or your overpriced shampoo, just remember, you're living the dream. Your medieval self is standing ankle deep in pig muck, smelling faintly of onions and old sweat, wondering what you'd look like with all that modern sparkle. You'd probably be accused of sorcery, or at least unbearable vanity. You step outside your door, still wearing yesterday's shirt, which is also last week's shirt, and breathe in that thick fermented aroma of village life. The air carries the scent of wet hay, livestock droppings, smoke from the morning fire and something floral, but don't get excited. That floral note is not lavender fields. It's someone a few doors down crushing herbs into a pouch and stuffing it under their armpits in the hopes of surviving another social interaction without being publicly gagged at. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the perfume game is not a luxury, it's a desperate act of olfactory defence. Let's not kid ourselves, there's no such thing as deodorant, no Febreze, no artisanal soaps from the farmer's market. So people turned to whatever they could grow, distill or scavenge to smell better, or at least not worse. You've probably already figured out that you're not getting clean today, so it's time to cover it all up. Enter perfume, herbs, scented oils and rosewater. These were your best hope of maintaining dignity in a time where your body was constantly at war with its own aroma. For the wealthy, things were a bit more pleasant. If you're noble, you might have access to a little vial of civet, a musky secretion scraped from the anal glands of a civet cat diluted with floral essences. And yes, it smells exactly as complicated as that sounds. Or maybe you're lucky enough to have imported some orange blossom water from Moorish Spain. Or you've commissioned your apothecary to brew something with clove cinnamon and powdered iris root. That's fancy. That's medieval money. You, however, are working with basic supplies. You crush mint leaves between your fingers and rub them on your wrists. You tie dried sage and thyme into little bundles and hang them inside your tunic like medieval deodorant nut pods. You might even dab some vinegar mixed with herbs behind your ears. Does it work? Kind of. For about an hour, then it's right back to eau de humain. Now here's a weird historical fact for tonight. People believed that strong scents could ward off disease. Because of the whole miasma theory, that idea that bad smells carried illness, it logically followed that good smells would protect you. This is why plague doctors wore those creepy bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices. They weren't just trying to terrify you, they genuinely thought they were filtering out death with a handful of rosemary and maybe some crushed juniper. In daily life, this meant that your basic medical hygiene overlapped heavily with your grooming. Scented gloves were popular among those who could afford them. Yes, gloves that had been soaked in perfume or infused with fragrant oils. The idea was that as you move through the street or court, the constant motion of your hands would keep a protective bubble of nice-smelling air around your face. A medieval personal air purifier. It wasn't effective, obviously, but it was fashionable. For the poorer crowd, flowers and herbs were your best weapon. On holy days, you might tuck fresh blossoms into your hair or under your belt. You'd scatter them across your floor to freshen up the place. Some folks even tied sachets of herbs to their belts to keep the stink of other people at bay. Which is honestly kind of genius. Turning yourself into a walking potpourri sachet just to survive the open market. Let's drift over to an open-air market now, since you're headed there anyway to trade for onions, eggs, and maybe a little hunk of stale bread. The scent hits you before the stalls come into view. Fish, meat, sweat, manure, spilt ale, and baked goods, all mingling in one bold, chaotic nose punch. And you blend right in. Every person you pass has their own signature smell and nobody's judging. They can't. They smell too what? Now here's the fringe fact for tonight. Some perfumes and oils used back then were so potent they were considered mildly toxic. Ever heard of ambergris? It's a waxy substance found in the digestive system of sperm whales, and it was insanely valuable as a perfume base. Rich people literally rubbed whale bath on themselves to smell nice. Some women used Venetian ceruse, essentially lead-based face paint, scented with rosewater. It made their skin pale and flawless, and slowly poisoned them. But hey, at least they died fragrant. The debate among scholars here gets interesting. Did people really stink all the time, or were they just used to different standards? Some historians argue that what we call dirty would have been the norm back then, and most noses would have been desensitized. Others suggest that medieval people worked hard in their own way to stay clean, using the tools and logic they had. The problem? Their version of cleanliness was entirely smell-based, and unfortunately odour alone doesn't stop the spread of bacteria. But culturally, scent mattered. Heavily. A person's smell could signal their class, their health, even their moral state. A foul odour might be interpreted as sin made physical, a pleasant one, probably the sign of virtue, or at least wealth. The church often linked cleanliness with purity, even though actual bathing was viewed with suspicion, a paradox, sure, but one that shaped every part of how people interacted with their own bodies. So you press on through the market, your herb sachet swinging at your waist, your minty wrists now dulled by the sun and the sweat. You buy your eggs, avoid eye contact with a guy selling eels from a questionable bucket, and get a whiff of something divine. It's a noblewoman, passing by in a flurry of perfume, silks, conducts, and powdered skin. She smells like imported lavender, and probably has no idea what it's like to rinse your hands in a rain barrel after shoveling out a pig pen. Still, you wonder, does she know how not to smell, or is someone else handling that for her? As the day winds down and you return to your cottage, the sun setting in golden streaks over the thatched rooftops, your own scent has shifted again. Less mint now, more smoke and baked onion. You're kind of your own candle, burning through layers of aroma hour by hour. And while it might not pass the modern sniff test, it means you're alive, you're fed, and you've survived another day without collapsing into a vat of rosewater and whale spit. Tomorrow, we tackle the glorious world of medieval dentistry, or what passed for it. So go ahead, smile while you still have most of your teeth. Your teeth are killing you. Not in the cute, ugh, I ate too many sweets kind of way. No, this is deep, persistent, throbbing pain. You've had a toothache for 3 days now, and you're starting to see things in the corners of your vision. It's medieval dental care time, and spoiler alert, you're not going to like your options. First things first, nobody in your village is brushing their teeth in the way you think of brushing. Toothbrushes as we know them are centuries away, and toothpaste is a modern fantasy. But that doesn't mean people are doing nothing. You reach for your chew stick, a small, fibrous twig, frayed at the end by biting. You rub it against your teeth as best you can, hoping to dislodge bits of last night's porridge. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it just makes your gums bleed. Tooth dust is another popular option, if you're fancy. It's a gritty powder made of ground up herbs, ashes, and even crushed seashells. You dab a little on your finger, maybe with some salt, and scrub like your life depends on it, because honestly, it might. Gum infections can turn septic. Dental abscesses can spread to the brain, but since no one really understands that, you just keep chewing sticks and praying to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. She's very busy. Your teeth themselves are, well, they've seen better days. They're not all rotten, but they're uneven, yellowish, and some are worn down to little nubs. That's normal. Medieval bread is hard, gritty, and full of stone-ground flour, sometimes literally stew. It's not uncommon for people to chip their teeth while eating. And since you don't have the luxury of soft processed food, your molars do most of the heavy lifting from the moment you're old enough to eat solids. Historical fact of the night. Archaeologists examining medieval skeletons have found surprisingly healthy teeth in many cases, especially among peasants. Why? Because sugar wasn't common in Europe until after the Crusades. No candy, no soda, no sticky junk stuck between molars. Your main threats weren't sweets, but grainy bread, constant jaw use, and complete dental neglect. That said, when decay did happen, it was catastrophic. You feel a jolt in your jaw again, sharp and angry. There's a black spot near your back molar. And the area's hot to the touch. What now? Time to see the village barber-surgeon. He's not a dentist, no one is. He's a guy with some tools, some nerve, and a very stained apron. He'll yank your tooth out while holding you down, possibly after giving you a swig of ale or pressing a cold rock to your forehead. He believes in balancing humours, so he might also let a little blood out of your arm for good measure. For the toothache, of course, totally logical. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Some people believe toothaches were caused by toothworms, yes. Tiny squirming creatures that lived inside your teeth and burrowed around, causing pain. It wasn't completely insane if you think about it. People could feel the movement, the pressure, the unexplained pulsing. Without microscopes, some invisible worms were as solid a guess as any. Some dentists even claimed to pull the worms out, though these were probably just little pieces of fibre or gunk passed off as proof of their skill. Back to your visit. The barber-surgeon doesn't use anaesthesia. He tells you to bite down on a strap of leather. You're trembling, trying not to cry in front of your neighbours, because this is happening in public. Most things are. With a rusted iron forceps, he clamps onto the aching tooth and pulls with all the elegance of someone hauling a tree stump from wet earth. There's a snap, a scream, possibly yours, and then blood. So much blood. It pours into your mouth and down your chin as he holds the tooth up in triumph. You may or may not pass out. When you wake up, someone's thrown a cloth over you. You're lying on a bench, dizzy and cold. The pain is still there, but it's different now and blunt, hollow. The ache has shifted into something you can live with. Probably, until the next one flares up, because there's no floss, no regular cleaning, no preventive care, just chewing sticks, salt and the occasional prayer. Here's where scholars start arguing again. Were medieval people just constantly in dental agony? Some suggest that the peasant diet, low in sugar, high in fibre, meant most people didn't have as many cavities as we might assume. Others point out that when decay did happen, there were 0 treatment options besides extraction, and you could lose most of your teeth by 30. In fact, having all your teeth in old age, it was considered miraculous. Not healthy. Miraculous. So how do you cope now that you're short one molar? You rinse your mouth with vinegar or wine to cleanse the area. That might help, temporarily. You chew on cloves for the pain. Some folks recommend onion juice. Others suggest rubbing the gums with honey, which, spoiler alert, only makes things worse. And when it comes to avoiding future issues, the best advice anyone offers is just don't eat things that are too hard. Revolutionary. You think about that noblewoman again, the one who walked past you smelling like imported lavender. She's probably got slightly better tools, maybe even some imported powders and pastes from Spain or the Arab world. The Muslim world, after all, had advanced dental knowledge at the time, but even so she's just as vulnerable to infection and decay. Riches can buy a perfume, but not enamel. As the sun sets and your mouth throbs in rhythm with your heartbeat, you lay back on your straw mattress, feeling grateful it wasn't worse. It could have been worse. You could have had a jaw infection, or a surgeon who also tried trepanning while he was at it. You survived. You're tired, aching, and mildly concussed, but you survived. That's about all you can hope for when your dentist also cuts hair and bleeds people on weekends. Tomorrow, we dig into what your breath smells like and why no one is doing anything about it. Hint, it involves garlic, beer, and possibly demonic possession. Your mouth feels like a battlefield. That molar's absence still throbs in the back of your jaw, and the coppery taste of dried blood hasn't fully gone away. You sit outside your cottage, staring into a bowl of gruel, and the moment your lips part to blow on the steam, you catch it. The unmistakable whiff of your own breath. It hits like a low blow. Warm, damp, sour, and weirdly reminiscent of boiled onions left out in the sun too long. Welcome to the uncharted wilds of medieval halitosis. Or, as they didn't call it back then, normal. Because here's the reality. Bad breath wasn't just a common medieval experience. It was expected. You don't brush your teeth or what's left of them. You don't floss, rinse, or gargle. Your dental care consists of that chew stick, the occasional scrape with a bone pick, and your tongue doing its best as an amateur scrubber. So when you exhale and get a nose full of your own dragon breath, you simply shrug. That's your face now. The concept of fresh breath as a social goal? That's a modern obsession. In your world, the scent of someone's mouth is a combination of their last meal, their dental decay, their gut health, spoiler not great, and the sheer amount of garlic they've consumed, which is a lot. You eat garlic with everything, not because you love it, but because it's considered medicinal. It warms the body, wards off illness, and, importantly, keeps other people at a distance. You might not know what a bacteria is, but you absolutely know that strong smells can protect you, or at least make people back up a few feet. Let's slide in a fun historical fact. Garlic and onions were two of the most commonly prescribed health foods in medieval Europe. Monks grew them in abundance, doctors recommended them for nearly everything, fevers, infections, fatigue, and peasants like yourself could actually afford them. As a result, entire villages smelled like a hearty soup base. That smell pouring from your mouth is both a badge of survival and a natural repellent for everyone else. You might try masking it occasionally. Maybe you chew a fennel seed or two, maybe a clove if you're lucky. If you're especially bold, or you've been hanging around the apothecary, you might rinse your mouth with wine, vinegar, or even urine. Yeah, that last one's a real thing. Aged urine was considered cleansing, even antiseptic, and some medical texts actually suggested it as a rinse for sore gums and mouth ulcers. It smells exactly as you'd expect, but it's a 1325, and beggars can't be mouthwashers. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In some medieval love spells, a person's breath played a key role. One charm suggested speaking into your lover's mouth while they slept to seal your desire into their breath, which is, of course, the most nightmarish idea imaginable when you remember how people's mouths actually smelled. But hey, it was romantic, in a post-garlic, pre-dental rinse sort of way. Now, the debate among scholars, it gets weirdly spicy. Some argue that bad breath wasn't even noticed in medieval society. If everyone smells equally rough, does anyone really notice? Others claim that it was an issue, just not one people openly discussed, more of an unspoken social cue. Monastic rules, for example, sometimes discouraged excessive speech, especially during meals. Some believe it was to preserve silence. Others think it might have been to avoid breathing onion air all over your neighbour's pottage. But don't assume bad breath had no consequences. There were still social layers to scent. Nobles, who had access to herbs, imported spices, and flavoured wines. Likely smelled slightly less offensive. They chewed licorice root or dried mint leaves, possibly even carried perfumed cloths to dab at their mouths. The wealthy also had better food, less fermented fish, fewer mystery stews, and that alone made their breath a touch more tolerable. You're chewing on tough bread, salted pork, and whatever root vegetable survived the last frost. Your breath has layers. None of them are minty. Let's say you're heading to the tavern tonight to unwind. Maybe sing a drinking song, maybe flirt with someone if your mouth cooperates. As you walk in, the air is thick with the stench of sweat, beer, smoke, and, you guessed it, breath. Loud, drunk, hot exhalations. Men leaning over tables, laughing, their mouths wide open to show off every crooked tooth and rotting molar. You blend right in, no one's judging you. They can't. They're too busy contributing to the atmospheric fog of expired mead and pickled onion. Still, there's etiquette. If someone's breath is especially bad, people will let them know, maybe with a comment, maybe by stepping back conspicuously, maybe by handing them a sprig of mint as a subtle hint, or a not-so-subtle insult. The real flex? Having good-smelling breath. It's rare, and it gets attention. People associate it with good health, cleanliness, and even piety. If your breath is sweet, you're basically halfway to sainthood. You leave the tavern with a full stomach, a slightly spinning head, and the sense that your mouth has gone from sour to swamp. But it's fine. No one kissed anyone tonight. There wasn't a lot of physical intimacy anyway, because touching, as we'll get into later, was risky business in a time of plagues, curses and open wounds. Back in your cottage, you pick at your teeth with a chicken bone, trying to get a bit of meat unstuck from a gap near your canine. It works, mostly. You spit the rest into the fire, wipe your hand on your tunic, and curl up to sleep. Your breath won't win any awards. Your gums are probably inflamed, but your mouth is functional. You can eat, shout, sing and mumble half-prayers to the ceiling beams. And in the Middle Ages, that's about as good as oral hygiene gets. But don't get too comfortable. Tomorrow we're getting into the clothes situation. And spoiler, washing them was even rarer than washing you. You pull on your tunic, again, and it's not exactly what you'd call fresh. It smells faintly of smoke, sweat and damp wool, like it just got back from a long emotional journey through a bog. You give it a casual shake, hoping to unstick whatever clung to it overnight, but it's stiff from yesterday's rain, and possibly the day before's too. There's a streak of something on the sleeve. Could be mud, could be animal, could be Tuesday. Welcome to your daily wardrobe in the Middle Ages, a layered strategy of textile-based denial. Let's set the scene. It's early morning and you're dressing for a day of work, travel, or, if you're really lucky, absolutely nothing. But your clothes aren't just fashion statements or protection from the elements. They're your entire hygiene plan. That outer woolen tunic you keep reusing? That's your shield. And underneath it you wear linen. Always linen. Linen is your saving grace. It's breathable. It wicks away sweat, and most importantly, it's washable. At least in theory. You probably own 2 sets of clothing if you're doing well. Maybe 3 if you're unusually lucky. 1 for everyday use, 1 for church or holy days, and maybe 1 threadbare backup for when the others are soaking wet. And by soaking wet, we mean someone braved the river and beat your underthings against a rock while muttering prayers that the water wouldn't give them cholera. There are no laundromats, no soap dispensers, just elbow grease, lye soap made from ashes and animal fat, and a whole lot of freezing fingers. And here's a juicy historical fact. Medieval people didn't wash their outer garments very often, especially the wool ones, because washing wool could shrink or ruin it. So they cleaned around the outer layers, changing and washing their linen shifts or chemises more frequently instead. Think of the linen as your body's sacrificial layer. It soaks up all the sweat and grime so the wool tunic can continue being reused until it physically walks away on its own. Now here's where it gets weird, in a delightful fringe fat kind of way. Some people thought that simply changing into clean clothes, even without bathing, counted as getting clean. You might be crusted in dirt from head to toe, but if you switch out your undertunic, congratulations, you're fresh. This led to the very common medieval practice of washing clothes separately from the body. It made sense. Changing into clean linen felt better, looked better. And, if you had scented sachets or herbs to tuck in the folds, smelled marginally better. Good enough. But clothes weren't just hygiene armour, they were also deeply social. What you wore told everyone what class you were in, what kind of work you did, what your gender and marital status were, even what sins you might be hiding. That deep red tunic? You probably paid through the nose for that dye, and people assume you're either wealthy or foolish. That unbleached linen shift under your outer layer? That's practical and likely to be full of holes. And let's not forget layering. In a world where hot baths are rare, and physical scrubbing is minimal, the more layers you wear, the more barriers you place between your skin and everyone else's nostrils. You might wear 2 tunics in winter, or 3 if you're noble and trying to show off. Undergarments, especially for women, were long, loose linen pieces that could be laundered without damaging the outer dress. So if you're sweating through your 5th consecutive day of fieldwork, at least the sweat is hitting washable fabric. Now, to answer the scholar debate of the night, did people actually care about being clean, or was everyone just trudging through filth in the same potato sack? Some scholars argue that while medieval people lacked our modern standards, they weren't totally oblivious. They took pride in orderly, well-kept clothing, even if it wasn't freshly washed. Monks, for example, had scheduled laundry days. Nobles had laundresses and wardrobe attendants. Even peasants, if they had access to a river and some spare time, would try to beat the grime out of their linens at least semi-regularly. The issue wasn't laziness, it was logistics. Water was heavy, soap was expensive, drying took forever, and weather was almost never on your side. And when clothes got really dirty, like crusted with stuff dirty, they didn't go to the wash. They went to the fire, or the rag pile, or got cut into strips and reused for bandages. You don't keep patching a tunic once it's more whole than fabric. You mourn it quietly, maybe curse the pig who stepped on it and move on. Today you walk down the lane in your not washed but frequently shaken tunic, layered over your once white linen. Other villagers pass by in similar outfits, drab, stiff, practical. A few kids are barefoot, wearing nothing but oversized shirts. You spot the baker's apprentice wearing a tunic that smells faintly of yeast and ash. The smell of the whole town is like a walking compost heap with occasional floral hints, depending on who rubbed what on their necks that morning. Still, no one's gagging. No one's staring. This is normal. You adapt, your nose adjusts, and the standards of cleanliness are shared by everyone around you. In a strange way, that's comforting. You all smell vaguely of wool, wood smoke, and the occasional turnip. That's community. Later in the evening, you do your version of laundry. You rinse your linen shirt in a wooden bucket with some cold water and crushed ash soap. It doesn't foam, but you can feel the slickness of the fat, and it does something. You slap it against a flat rock a few times, then hang it over a tree branch to dry. It will be stiff tomorrow. It might still smell like the river, but it will be different dirty, and that's close enough to clean. Before bed, you change into your backup shift, which is thinner and patched in the wrong places, but blessedly dry. You crawl under your itchy blanket, surrounded by the faint scent of lye and wood smoke, and breathe a little easier. You've worn the same outer tunic for over a week, but your linen, technically fresh. You're basically sparkling. Tomorrow we head to the barber shop, and let's just say it's less spa day and more bloodletting, teeth-yanking, gossip, and maybe a shave if there's time. It's barely past dawn, and already there's a small line forming outside the barber's little wooden hut at the edge of the village square. You're not here just for a haircut, though let's be honest, the clump of hair on the back of your head is starting to resemble a damp bird's nest. No, you're here because your neighbour swears by the local barber for, well, everything. Headaches? Go to the barber. Toothaches? Definitely the barber. Need a minor amputation? You guessed it. This place is the medieval equivalent of a spa, clinic, social club and low-budget horror movie all rolled into one. You step inside and immediately regret it. The room smells like warm iron, herbs, sweat and a damp cloth. There's a single stool, a bucket of water that probably wasn't changed this week, and an assortment of tools laid out on a wobbly wooden shelf. Scissors, razors, forceps, clamps, and something disturbingly hook-shaped. There's no such thing as sterilisation, of course. The same blade that trims your beard might have just been inside someone's mouth, or groin, or both. The barber greets you with a nod. He's cheerful, which is unsettling. His apron is stained a variety of reds and browns, none of which you care to analyse too closely. He asks you what you need today. You consider saying a time machine, but instead, you mutter that you want a trim and maybe, just maybe, a look at the boil on your neck that's been bothering you. His eyes light up. You've given him a project. First, the trim. He pours a bit of lukewarm water over your hair, just enough to make it damp, not enough to count as cleaning, and starts hacking away with short, uneven strokes. Hair falls to the floor in damp clumps. You sit very still, partly to help him get a better angle, partly because if he slips, the blade might take off more than just a lock of hair. Fun historical fact. The red and white striped barber pole comes from this exact setup. The red symbolises blood, the white is for the bandages used after, and the pole itself? That's what patients used to grip tightly during procedures, something to clutch while your soul considered leaving your body through the nearest open wound. So yes, your local barbershop has a legacy steeped in pain, not pompadours. With your hair now slightly shorter and equally greasy, the barber eyes your neck boil with glee. He presses a thumb against it, and it flares with pain like a small demon waking up. Ripe, he says, which is not a word you want associated with your own skin. He heats the tip of a small blade over a candle flame, then asks if you've eaten today. You haven't. He grins. Good. He slices the boil open in one smooth move, presses a rag to it and waits for the pus to drain. You try not to faint, mostly out of pride. The entire procedure takes less than a minute. He pats it dry with a cloth that smells faintly of mould and rosemary, then sprinkles something powdery on top. Ground sage, maybe, or ashes. There's no antiseptic, just the hope that your body knows what it's doing. Infection? Always a possibility. Death? A coin toss. Now, for the gossip. Because the barber isn't just your unofficial doctor, he's also the village news anchor. As you sit there holding your oozing neck with a filthy rag, he starts talking. Did you hear that the miller's wife ran off with the baker's apprentice, and that the Lord Steward has a new mistress, possibly imported from Normandy? You nod occasionally, your head spinning slightly from blood loss and scandal. This is how news spreads, between bloodlettings and back-alley haircuts. And speaking of bloodletting, that's still on the table if you want it. The theory of humours is alive and well, and your local barber has no issues slicing open a vein to balance your fluids. Feeling sluggish? You've got too much black bile, restless, too much blood, he'll happily bleed you for either. In fact, he suggests it now, as a little pick-me-up. You politely decline, though it's probably only a matter of time before someone forces a bleed on you during a fever. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. Barbers were often more trusted than physicians in rural areas. Why? Because they were available. They were practical, and they didn't try to diagnose your soul while physicians spoke in Latin and charged exorbitantly for leech consultations. Barbers just cut to the chase, literal. They were surgeons without the degree, the hands-on types, the kind of people who didn't need a chart to tell if your leg was broken. Now, let's talk about scholarly debates. Some historians argue that medieval barbers were underrated medical professionals, deeply experienced, intuitive and adaptable. Others paint them as butchers with blades, happy to slice anything for a few coins. The truth, of course, lies somewhere in the middle. Barbers were a mixed bag. Some were skilled enough to save lives, others couldn't find a vein with both hands and a prayer. Either way, they were often your only option. As you step out of the barber shop, your neck sore and your head lighter, you pass a young man holding a chicken under one arm. He's here for help with a swollen foot. You don't ask question, you just keep walking, feeling vaguely accomplished and slightly infected. Your new haircut isn't stylish, but it doesn't smell like old gravy anymore, so that's something. You dab at the cloth still clinging to your neck and make a mental note to avoid mirrors for a while. Not that you have one. The closest thing you've got is a polished metal plate, and right now your reflection looks more like a mugshot from a very unlucky timeline. You go to bed that night with a dull ache, a head that feels 20% lighter, and the knowledge that despite everything you survived a trip to the barber. You didn't get bled, your boil didn't kill you yet, and you're reasonably sure he didn't reuse a scalpel straight from someone's toe. Tomorrow, you're heading to the bathhouse. But don't get excited, it's less hygiene and more medieval spa meets moral panic. You wake up to the sound of bells, not church bells, but the clanging, echoing ring of someone hauling a large copper cauldron down the cobbled path behind your home. The bathhouse is open today. You know this because the town's water bearers have been busy since dawn, dragging barrels from the well and shouting half-hearted curses at each other. It's bath day, or at least the closest thing you'll get to one. And yes, you should be excited. Warm water, steam, a moment to sit still and let the grime melt off your skin. But you're not excited, because nothing about the medieval bathhouse is simple, or pure, or particularly clean. Still, your joints ache, your neck wound from yesterday's barber adventure is sticky with God knows what, and your skin feels like it's growing an extra layer of film. So you gather your shift, your belt pouch, and a piece of scented linen to hold to your nose just in case and start walking. Bathhouses have a weird reputation in your village. They're public, semi-religious, semi-illicit places that exist in this awkward in-between of sacred cleansing and low-key scandal. The church, of course, has mixed feelings about the whole thing. On one hand, cleansing the body is good. Purifying the flesh, removing the stink of sin, fantastic. On the other hand, bathhouses tend to have steam, and privacy and nudity. And when you mix all that with bored villagers and a lack of anything resembling entertainment, things can get suggestive. As you approach, the first thing you notice is the smell. Wet wood, burned herbs, hot metal, and old water. It's not terrible. In fact, compared to your average day, it's practically a perfume ad. Inside, the bathhouse is divided into a few cramped rooms, sectioned off with wooden slats and sagging curtains. There's a hot room where the air is thick and damp, a warm room where people undress and get used to the heat, and a cold plunge outside for the brave or the pious. You're not that brave. Now here's your historical fact. Communal bathhouses weren't just tolerated, they were once celebrated. In cities like Paris and Nuremberg, dozens of bathhouses thrived during the High Middle Ages. They were seen as places of health, comfort, and even social bonding. In fact, bathing together wasn't considered scandalous at first. Men and women often shared tubs, sometimes even married couples or groups of friends. There were candles, wine, food, and music. Think less scrub and go, and more hang out naked in a hot tub with your neighbours. You know, wholesome. But of course, nothing gold can stay. Over time, bathhouses developed reputations, and not for the temperature of their water. By the 14th and 15th centuries, bathhouses were increasingly associated with immoral behaviour. Some became known fronts for brothels. Others were simply seen as too sensual for a society still reeling from the Black Death and moral panic. As plague swept through towns, people began to blame the bathhouses, those open pores again, welcoming disease into soft, steamy skin. Cleanliness became dangerous, suspicious, almost sinful, which brings us to your bath today. The place is not packed, but not empty either. A few older men grumble in the corner, soaking up warmth with their limbs stretched out like soggy breadsticks. A woman hums softly as she pours warm water over her child, the steam rising around them like holy smoke. You pick an empty tub, wooden, stained and steaming slightly, and lower yourself in, hissing at the heat as it wraps around your legs. For a moment, it's bliss. The first real warmth on your skin in weeks. You lean back, close your eyes, and nearly forget where you are. Then someone coughs, wet, rattling, and too close. You open your eyes and remember exactly where you are. This water? It's communal. It's probably been reused at least once today and filtered through cloth at best. There's no chlorine, no filtration system, no real separation between your body and the person who just sneezed into their palm. You're marinating in a medieval broth of strangers' sweat, skin flakes, and whatever stew of microbes happens to be in circulation this week. Yum. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Bathhouses sometimes offered scraping services, where attendants used blunt knives or shells to scrape dead skin and grime from your body. It was meant to be hygienic, even luxurious, but most of the time the same tools were used over and over. If you're lucky, the scrape is just uncomfortable. If you're not, it opens a sore that gets infected and starts your personal side quest into medieval medicine again. Despite the risks, you can't deny how good it feels, being submerged, being warm, being still. You rub at your arms, surprised by how much dirt comes off. You try to wash your hair with water alone, which mostly just redistributes the oil. Still, it's a reset. A psychological clean, if not a biological one. Now let's talk scholarly debate. Were bathhouses really dens of sin, or is that just post-plague propaganda from a church desperate to reassert control? Some researchers argue that the association between bathhouses and brothels was overblown, often pushed by reformers trying to shut down anything fun. Others suggest that things got steamy, both literally and figuratively. When you mix warm water, naked bodies and a total lack of privacy, people get ideas. Either way, bathhouses became casualties of shifting morality and epidemic fears. By the 16th century, many were shut down completely, or turned into sweat rooms with no water at all. You finish your soak and stand slowly, water dripping from your limbs. You dry off with a coarse linen cloth that feels like sandpaper and grit. You redress in the same clothes you wore in, because of course you did. You exit into the open air, feeling lighter, warmer and slightly delusional. For a few hours, maybe even a full day, you will smell less alarming. Your skin is softer, your soul feels vaguely less haunted. But as you walk home through streets lined with refuse, pig tracks, and chamber pot drippings, the bathhouse dream starts to wear off. You remember that this world isn't designed to keep you clean. It's designed to keep you functional. And today you function just a little better than yesterday. Tomorrow, we're going to the bathroom, or more accurately, learning what people did before bathrooms existed. Spoiler, you're going to miss toilets more than you ever thought possible. You're halfway through your morning chores when nature calls, and not the poetic kind. There's no ignoring it. Your stomach churns with the urgency of someone who just drank river water after a night of heavy ale. And now you're left with that timeless medieval question. Where do I go? The answer, unfortunately, is basically anywhere that won't get you fined or shamed by your neighbours. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval toilets, or rather the lack of them. Because unless you're a noble with a castle privy or a monk in a well-funded abbey, you're squatting wherever decency, or lack thereof, allows. For a common villager like you, it's all about location, privacy, and making sure you don't step in someone else's bad decision from earlier that morning. Let's start at home. You live in a one-room cottage with a dirt floor, a thatched roof, and maybe a few chickens wandering in and out. There's no attached bathroom, no outhouse with a cute moon carved in the door. What you have is a chamber pot, a simple clay or wooden bowl tucked in the corner under your bed or near the hearth. It's where you do your business at night, when it's too cold, dark, or dangerous to step outside. In the morning, you, or someone you love, takes that pot and dumps it somewhere not too close to the house, preferably downhill, hopefully not into the drinking stream. Sometimes it goes into a cesspit, a deep hole dug in the ground lined with stones or wood. More often it ends up in the open trench that runs through the middle of the village, the same one carrying rainwater, dishwater, pig slop, and whatever else needed flushing. The smell, breathtaking, in a way that makes your eyes water. Now here's a surprisingly elegant historical fact. Some medieval castles had internal latrines, called garde-robes. These were stone-built toilet nooks built right into the castle walls. You'd sit over a hole that dropped your waist down a shaft, usually emptying into the moat or a cesspit below. In theory, it kept things simple and sanitary. In practice, the smell would waft right back up the shaft, and sometimes the moat was the same one supplying your water. engineering and progress. There were other names for medieval toilets too: jakes, privies, long drops, necessary houses. In monasteries, the communal toilet was often called the reredoter, connected directly to the dormitory via a covered walkway. It had actual seating arrangements, drainage systems, and sometimes even running water via diverted streams. Of course, that kind of luxury was rare, and didn't stop the occasional overflow. Now here's your fringe fact. Some medieval people believed that flatulence was actually healthy. Letting it out was seen as good bodily maintenance. In fact, holding it in was discouraged, especially during illness. One monk even wrote a whole treatise about how passing gas kept the humours in balance. So if you let one rip during Mass, you might be gross, but you're also spiritually balanced. Just don't expect applause. So what happens when you're out and about and suddenly need to go? Well, there's no public toilet system. If you're in the countryside, you find a hedgerow and do what needs doing. If you're in a town, you look for an alleyway, a quiet corner, or, if you're lucky, a public latrine near the market. Some cities, like London, had common privies, but they were often dark, reeking cubicles maintained by the city or a private guild. And maintained is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And don't get smug thinking the nobles had it all figured out. Yes, they had fancier guardrobes, but many of them also just used close stools, essentially portable toilet boxes lined with straw or cloth. A servant would carry the stool in, the lord or lady would do their business, and someone else would carry the waste away. You really haven't lived until you've emptied your employer's chamber pot into the castle moat on a windy day. Now for the part you've been dreading, toilet paper. Spoiler alert, it doesn't exist, not in any convenient double-ply quilted sense. What you use depends entirely on your location and social class. Moss, straw, hay, wool scraps, or even your hand, followed by a rinse if you're lucky, are all fair game. In cities, people might use old rags, which were then reused, often communally. Monks sometimes use smooth stones or bits of broken pottery. Yes, pottery. Think about that next time you complain about the cheap brand being too scratchy. Here's where the scholarly debate really gets messy. How bad were sanitation conditions, really? Some historians argue that medieval people were more aware of waste management than we give them credit for. There were ordinances about where you could dump chamber pots. Towns had rakers, sanitation workers who cleared the streets of refuse. Monasteries had designated waste channels. But others point to the sheer volume of archaeological evidence. Human waste in every corner, high contamination levels into soil samples, and reports of epidemics blamed on foul air as proof that sanitation was mostly reactive, not preventive. Let's return to your morning situation. You decide not to use the chamber pot, it's already been dumped today. So you head to the edge of the field behind your cottage, find a quiet patch near the trees, and handle things as discreetly as possible. You wipe with a handful of leaves and hope for the best. You avoid making eye contact with your neighbour, who's clearly doing the same thing 10 feet away behind a bush. You both pretend not to see each other. This is village etiquette. You make your way back home, hands carefully held away from your tunic until you can rinse them in the rain barrel, your only source of fresh water nearby. There's no soap, just a handful of sand or ashes to scrub with. It helps, sort of. You dry your hands on the hem of your already filthy shift and move on with your day. As you stir the cooking pot and throw a few herbs in to mask the scent of yesterday's cabbage, you try not to think about the trench just outside the door, or the number of flies currently orbiting your window, or the fact that every person you know is basically one bad sneeze away from reintroducing the plague. Still, you're surviving, you're adapting, and you're now intimately familiar with the medieval version of indoor plumbing. Tomorrow we dive into the joys of rural peasant waste management. Get ready for night soil, dung beetles, and the surprisingly sacred art of the compost heap. The smell hits you before you see it, a deep earthy stench, layered with the tang of decay, wet straw, and something faintly metallic that makes the back of your throat tighten. You step outside with a full chamber pot in your hands, carefully, because one stumble means your shoes, if you're lucky enough to own a pair, become instant biohazards, and head to the edge of the property where the waste heap lies, steaming gently in the early morning sun. It's not all that glamorous, but it's routine. This is how your village manages human waste. One shovelful, splash and shuffle at a time. Today we're deep diving into the art, yes, art of medieval rural waste management. If you're imagining a compost pile lovingly maintained by villagers in wide-brimmed hats while they hum folk songs, think again. Think instead of a semi-strategic dumping ground, always on the outskirts of the community, sometimes fenced in, sometimes not, where everyone's leavings, human, animal, vegetable, get layered together like a terrible ever-fermenting cake. You pour your chamber pot out with a grimace and a practiced wrist flick to avoid splashback, then turn to toss the day's scraps, onion peels, mouldy bread, the brittle bones of last night's rabbit, into the same heap. This is called the midden, a deceptively cosy-sounding term for what is essentially the village's digestive system. It swallows everything, and miraculously, it gives something back. Because here's the historical fact: medieval farmers, particularly peasants, understood the value of organic waste. Long before the words sustainable agriculture were whispered in vegan cafes, they were practicing a brutal but effective form of nutrient recycling. Dung from animals, cows, pigs, chickens, was collected and mixed with straw to create muck heaps. These were then aged into fertilizer and spread across the fields to enrich the soil. It was smelly, messy, and incredibly labor-intensive, but it worked. Without it, crops wouldn't grow, and you'd be one bad harvest away from chewing on tree bark and prayer. And yes, human waste was part of that process, though with a little more caution. So-called night soil, a polite term for what you're thinking, is often collected separately, stored, and then sometimes sold to local landowners. Not every village did this formally, but the idea existed. Even your bowel movements could be of use to someone wealthier than you. Social mobility in its rawest form. Which brings us to a weird, squirm-inducing fringe fact. Dung beetles, worms, and other decomposers were sometimes seen as useful, even sacred. In parts of Europe, particularly during pagan holdovers, beetles were considered part of nature's recycling system, cleansing, transforming, returning waste to the earth. Some farmers would even seed their midden with known decomposers, hoping to accelerate the breakdown process. You didn't exactly have science, but you had observation. And you knew that when the worms were thriving, the soil was too. There's a certain rhythm to it all. Each household handles their own waste on a daily basis. Larger farms hire labourers, often children, or the elderly, to muck out stalls, shovel dung, and cart it to the spreading fields. In towns, waste is sometimes collected by rakers or gong farmers, who have the least enviable job titles in history. These men would enter cesspits with long-handled shovels and pull out the sludge, carrying it off in carts. The smell followed them everywhere. They were both essential and avoided like cursed objects. The debate among scholars gets interesting here. Some argue that rural communities actually had a better grasp of waste management than cities. In towns, waste built up fast and had nowhere to go. In the countryside, space was plentiful, and people could rotate their heaps, rest their fields, and allow natural processes to do the hard work. Others argue that it was still an unsanitary mess, especially during heavy rains, when the contents of your dung heap could float merrily downhill into your neighbour's yard or water source. You've seen that happen, more than once. It's why you never drink from the stream after a storm. Now, let's talk about the pigs. They are not just livestock, they are part of your sanitation crew. Pigs will eat almost anything: vegetable scraps, spoiled grains, small rodents, and yes, even human waste. They root through middens, clear out garbage piles, and leave behind their own rich, steaming offerings. It's disgusting. It's efficient. It's the circle of life, but with more grunting and less music. And here's the part no one likes to admit. You're used to it. You've grown up surrounded by smells that would send a modern nose straight into a panic attack. You've played near the midden, dug for worms, scattered pig feed across fresh manure. Your immune system isn't just tough, it's been forged in the fires of absolute olfactory chaos. That doesn't mean you like it. It just means you don't complain. Not much. You rinse your hands with the cold water from the rain barrel, scrub them with a fistful of dry grass, and wipe them on your tunic. You don't have soap. Not really. If you're lucky, there's a lump of harsh lye-based soap somewhere in the village, reserved for laundry or special occasions. But for everyday messes, it's friction, elbow grease, and lowered standards. The rest of your day involves more of the same. You muck out the animal pen, you haul a bucket of slop to the pigs, you check the cabbage patch for signs of rot or beetles. All of it is connected by one unspoken rule: waste in, waste out. It's dirty, back-breaking work. But you get it. You understand the cycle. Without waste, there's no food. Without food, there's no life. And without life, well, you're worm food anyway. At sunset, the wind shifts, carrying a gust from the direction of the midden. You wrinkle your nose automatically, though it's mostly for show, you barely notice anymore. The villagers gather nearby for supper, seated on logs and stones, their hands smelling of soil, sweat, and whatever they touched last. No one comments on the smell. Why would they? Everyone here smells like earth, like animals, like life decaying and rebirthing itself endlessly. Tomorrow, you'll learn why no one's touching each other very much, and how fear of disease, sin, and supernatural corruption kept people more socially distant than you might expect in a world with no deodorant. You're sitting near the hearth, chewing slowly through a dinner of barley stew and bread so hard it could double as building material, when someone passes too close behind you. Your entire body tenses, instinctively recoiling from the brief brush of fabric against your shoulder. You didn't mean to move, you didn't even think about it, but in the back of your mind, in the part where superstition and survival instinct hold hands, you remember what your mother told you. Don't let people touch your skin too much. You never know what might be living on them. Welcome to the Don't Touch Me era of medieval hygiene, where physical contact isn't just socially awkward, it's downright dangerous. Touch means risk. Germ theory doesn't exist yet, but the effects of contact are well observed. A child touches as a sick parent, and they get sick too. A servant tends to a feverish lord, and by morning there was shaking in the corner with the same disease. There's no microscope to confirm it, but people have eyes. They've made the connection. Touch spreads something, so naturally people avoid it. Not always, of course. You still share beds, pass bowls, and occasionally hug your relatives, carefully, briefly, when the situation demands it. But idle touch, affectionate patting, long embraces, that's rare, risky, and, depending on your local religious preacher, potentially sinful. Historical fact for the night. During plagues and epidemics, many towns and villages imposed actual bans on touching. Physical closeness was monitored, especially in marketplaces and churches. In some cities, sick individuals were forced to wear bells or carry sticks, signalling others to stay away. Funeral rites were altered to reduce physical contact with the dead. And sometimes when fear outpaced understanding, even family members were left to die alone, untouched, unburied, unspoken for. But long before plague patrols and quarantine measures, medieval folk already had deeply ingrained social boundaries when it came to touching skin. Skin, after all, was where diseases showed themselves. Rashes, boils, lesions, even acne could be interpreted as a sign of divine punishment. So when someone's face looked off or their hands had strange spots, you didn't get curious. You stepped back, maybe made the sign of the cross, maybe whispered a little prayer to Saint Sebastian and moved on. And then there's the church. Oh, the church had thoughts about touch. In monasteries, physical contact was strictly regulated. Monks were discouraged, sometimes forbidden, from even shaking hands. Touch was associated with temptation, corruption, and distraction. The more holy you aspired to be, the less you were supposed to touch or be touched. You couldn't avoid communal living, of course, but you could draw the line at emotional closeness, especially if it involved your actual fingers. Here's your fringe fact. The hand of glory, a dried and mummified hand of a hanged man, was believed to possess magical powers, including the ability to paralyze or render someone unconscious with just a touch. Yeah. Touch wasn't just risky biologically, it was dangerous spiritually. You might be brushing up against someone who, in their own small way, is cursed. And yet, despite all this, you need people. You rely on them for everything: work, food, shelter, survival. But the closeness has limits. You hand tools to each other, but you avoid skin-to-skin contact. You sit beside one another, but shoulders don't touch unless it's absolutely necessary. In cold months, you huddle for warmth, but always layered, always separated by fabric. The rules are unwritten, but clear. If someone touches you with bare skin, and it's not family or part of a medical emergency, your first response isn't pleasure, it's suspicion. Let's not forget the added anxiety of lice, fleas, and other uninvited guests. If someone touches you, they might leave behind more than just sweaty fingerprints. Lice crawl from head to head, fleas jump from tunic to tunic, and if your skin starts itching mysteriously a day later, you'll lie awake scratching in terror, trying to remember who got too close. You won't be mad at them, just quietly horrified, and you'll probably burn your bedding. Now, the scholarly debate. Did medieval people really avoid touch? Or are modern historians reading too much into sparse records and religious texts? Some argue that touch was still common, After all, people danced, hugged, kissed on the cheek and crammed into beds like sardines. Others say that those were necessities, not preferences. People touched because they had to, not because they wanted to. And the emotional distancing around physical contact likely ran much deeper than the surviving documents suggest. You, for example, are friendly. You like your neighbours, but you still flinch when the blacksmith claps your shoulder with a soot-covered hand. It's not personal, it's just that you've seen boils bloom after handshakes. You've heard stories of people growing feverish after a too-friendly kiss at the tavern. You've been raised on warnings, not hugs. Even the act of helping someone sick is calculated. If your sibling gets a fever, you help, sure, but you do it with cloth wrapped around your hands. You spoon water into their mouth while whispering prayers for your own immunity. You wash your hands afterward with vinegar or strong-smelling herbs, not because they kill anything, but because they feel like they do. It's about ritual, about control in a world where actual control doesn't exist. And yet the hunger for touch is still there. You see it in the way people linger beside one another a moment too long, in the way they press hands through cloth, shoulder to shoulder in church pews, in the brief touches that happen in the dark, when fear recedes for a moment and connection sneaks through. Because touch is human, and even when it's risky, sometimes you crave it more than safety. Later that evening, you're sitting with your family. Your mother brushes your hair gently with her fingers, calloused and warm, and for once, you don't flinch. She murmurs something under her breath, a prayer or a memory, and you lean in just slightly, letting her hand rest on your head. It's the first direct touch you've felt in days, maybe longer. It feels strange, unfamiliar, wonderful. Tomorrow we're going to dig into lice. Not metaphorically, literally. Combs, ash, fingernails, and the widespread medieval tradition of giving up halfway through. It starts with a tickle, right at the base of your scalp. You scratch just a little, and move on with your day, but then it happens again. A few minutes later, then again, harder. Before long, you're clawing at your hair like there's treasure buried in there. And spoiler, there kind of is, if your idea of treasure includes tiny grey insects with a thirst for blood and no sense of personal space. Congratulations, you've got lice. Again, this isn't surprising. In fact, it's borderline expected. In medieval life, lice are just part of the package, like splinters or the constant risk of getting kicked by a horse. Everyone has them. From the lowest peasant to the most elegantly perfumed noble, those little six-legged nightmares don't discriminate. They live in your hair, your clothes, your bedding, and sometimes your eyebrows if they're feeling adventurous. And the worst part, you've basically stopped being shocked about it. You reach for your comb, a fine-toothed wooden one you carved yourself or traded for at the market. It's not a luxury, it's a survival tool. Twice a day, if you have time, you sit down, tilt your head forward, and run the comb slowly through your hair. You listen for the quiet tap as lice bounce off the comb's edge and hit the wooden bowl you hold in your lap. Then you crush them, fingernail to thumbnail, snap, pop, snap. It's gross, it's satisfying, it's necessary. Here's a historical fact. Medieval people absolutely knew about lice. They wrote about them, joked about them, cursed them, and treated them like a regular part of life. Manuscripts from the period mention delousing routines with almost casual acceptance. Combs from the Middle Ages have been found in archaeological digs all over Europe, and many of them are double-sided. One side for normal brushing, the other side fine-toothed for pest control. These weren't beauty tools, they were weapons in the long, unwinnable war against itch. And yes, people got creative. If combing didn't work, or if you just gave up, you could try other methods. Rubbing your scalp with ashes was popular. It didn't kill the lice, but it made your hair less appealing. Some folks used vinegar, though it stung like betrayal if you had any cuts. Others tried herbal mixtures, lavender, rosemary, thyme, all crushed and steeped into a scalp wash that maybe, just maybe, irritated the lice enough to leave. Spoiler, they didn't. Let's pause for a fringe fact. In some regions, especially in colder parts of Europe, people simply shaved their heads to deal with lice. It was extreme but effective, if you were willing to deal with cold ears and some odd looks. For monks, especially those living communally, shaving was common anyway. The tonsure, the iconic shaved patch on the crown of the head, made lice removal easier. Whether that was the intention or not, some even kept cats specifically to hunt the rodents that carried fleas, which, to no one's surprise, were just as fond of humans as lice were. But here's the problem. Even if you delouse yourself completely, your clothes are still crawling. Your undertunic, your woolen outer layer, your sleeping blanket. Lice live in the seams and folds, laying eggs that cling like they've got a mortgage to protect. And washing clothes? Not exactly a weekly event. So even when your scalp feels temporarily clean, all it takes is one night of sleep and they're back, doing laps around your neck and having a little feast behind your ears. And it's not just lice. Fleas, ticks and bedbugs are fellow travellers on your personal skin safari. Fleas especially love crowded households with warm straw bedding. You can spend all day picking lice off your scalp only to lie down and wake up covered in flea bites. And if you're lucky enough to own animals, and unlucky enough to share your living space with them, you can expect some crossover infestation. The pigs aren't the only ones scratching. Now comes the scholarly debate. Did people really just live with lice and shrug it off? Or were they more aggressive about getting rid of them than we assume? Some historians argue that the sheer number of combs found in excavations suggests that people took delousing seriously, especially since cleanliness was often linked to piety and social status. Others counter that most efforts were inconsistent at best, and that delousing was more like brushing your teeth in a zombie apocalypse, something you do, but never enough to win. You pause mid-comb to inspect the bowl. 4 lice, 2 look suspiciously plump. You crush them with grim determination and sigh. You're tired, your scalp is raw, and you still have to check your children's heads, your spouse's tunic, and maybe, if you're feeling really generous, your neighbour's cloak. Because delousing isn't just personal maintenance, it's community survival. You help each other, not out of kindness, but because if they have lice, you have lice. It's the medieval version of herd immunity, which brings us to the worst part of all, the giving up, or every few weeks you just, stop trying. You let them win. You scratch absent-mindedly, dig at your scalp until it flakes and accept your fate. The lice aren't guests anymore. They're tenants. And while you hate them, you're too tired, too busy, too cold to fight every single day. You'll try again next week, or when the itching gets unbearable, or when someone starts noticing you scratching in church. You go to bed that night with your comb nearby, your hair braided loosely to reduce tangles, and a small cloth soaked in vinegar under your pillow. It probably won't help, but it's a gesture, a ritual, a tiny act of resistance in the face of endless invasion. Tomorrow we'll visit the monks, those quiet, bald bastions of routine and rules, who may have been the unexpected hygiene innovators of their time. Just don't expect them to smell like incense. You wake up to the sound of bells again, but this time it's not the bathhouse or a water cart, it's the monastery calling the monks to morning prayer. You're not part of their world exactly, but you live close enough to hear the rhythm of their lives, the bells, the chants, the shuffling of sandals on stone. And today you're lucky, or maybe desperate, because you're heading there to ask for a salve for the rash on your arms that won't go away. You've tried vinegar, ash, and muttering threats at it, but the rash seems unmoved by your efforts. Time to visit the monks, the unlikely gatekeepers of cleanliness and healing. From the outside, the monastery is simple. Stone walls, narrow windows, a tidy herb garden out front that smells like sage and basil. Inside, it's quiet, eerily so. Everything is done with purpose, no idle chatting, no running. The monks live by a strict routine built on prayer, labour, study, and surprisingly hygiene. Yes, you heard that right. While the rest of the world is wallowing in its own filth and hoping it doesn't catch fire, monasteries are quietly becoming accidental hygiene hubs. A brother in a brown habit greets you, his hand stained green from working in the garden. You explain your rash and he nods, already turning to fetch something from their storeroom. He doesn't lecture, doesn't frown, just works. That's what they do here. Grow herbs, make salves, copy texts, and try not to punch each other over who gets the cleanest sandals. It's surprisingly efficient. Here's your historical fact. Monasteries in medieval Europe often had better hygiene practices than the surrounding villages, or even noble estates. Many had running water systems, rudimentary, yes, but effective. Water was channeled from nearby the springs into cisterns, and from there it was used for cooking, bathing and cleaning. Monks washed their hands before meals, had designated latrines, reredautors, attached to the dormitories and followed a weekly bathing schedule. Yes, actual scheduled bathing. You want to cry from jealousy. Why all the effort? 2 reasons. First, discipline. Monastic life was about order, routine, and avoiding sin through structure. Cleanliness, while not pursued for its own sake, became part of that structure. Second, communal living. When you've got 30 or 40 monks living in close quarters, lice outbreaks, dysentery, and rotting feet become everyone's problem. So the monks preempted it, not because they were germaphobes, but because they needed to stay functional, and because vomiting during Vespers was generally discouraged. You're led to a small room off the cloister walk where clay pots line the shelves. The monk opens one and shows you the contents, a thick greenish paste that smells strongly of mint and something metallic. He tells you it's a mixture of comfrey, goose fat and vinegar. You nod like you understand what any of that means. He tells you to apply it twice a day and not to scratch. You nod again, while mentally preparing to scratch it the second you leave. Fringe fact time. Medieval monastic pharmacies weren't just shelves of dried plants, they were surprisingly advanced. Some monasteries kept written records of their remedies, detailing dosages, applications and effects. They traded knowledge with other monasteries across Europe and, in some cases, incorporated herbal medicine from Arabic texts. These monks might not have had microscopes, but they weren't guessing. They were observing, testing, and, most importantly, not bleeding you just because you sneezed twice. Now comes the debate. Were monks truly ahead of their time in terms of hygiene? Or are we romanticising a few clean corners in a generally filthy world? Some historians argue that while monasteries had rules and routines, not all were strictly followed, especially in poorer or more remote regions. Others point to archaeological findings, like clean latrines, soap-making areas, and even bathhouses connected to abbeys, as evidence that compared to the average medieval peasant, monks were basically living in a Renaissance hotel spa. You don't see a bathhouse here, but you do spot a basin in the cloister courtyard where a monk is washing his feet. Washing, with water, out in the open. You stare a little too long and get a disapproving glance from an older brother polishing a candlestick. You turn your gaze to the herb garden instead, where neat rows of calendula, yarrow and lavender sway gently in the breeze. It's so orderly, so not infested with lice. You wonder how many rules you'd have to follow to live here. Too many, probably. As you leave with your clay pot of medicinal goo, you feel something weird. Hope. Not in a grand transformative sense, just the quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing someone somewhere is at least trying to be clean. The kind that comes from seeing running water channeled through a sandstone trench and thinking, why don't we all do that? You've grown up assuming that filth is just the default state of the world, but maybe, just maybe, it doesn't have to be. Back at home, you apply the salve as instructed. It stings, then tingles, then fades into a cooling sensation that makes you sigh out loud. You lie down on your straw mattress, clay pot carefully capped beside you, and feel a little less disgusting than usual, for now your skin is covered in something that wasn't made by accident, and that's more than you expected from today. Tomorrow we revisit one of humanity's darkest hours, when the Black Death arrived, and suddenly cleanliness wasn't just about comfort or discipline. It became a matter of life and death. And spoiler, most people were very bad at figuring out which was which. It starts with a rumour. A merchant's wife in the next village over is dead, along with 3 of her children. No one knows why. Then the baker's apprentice in your own town starts coughing up blood. 2 days later, he's buried behind the chapel without a priest present. Then it's everywhere. Black lumps in the armpits and groin, high fevers, bodies piled on carts like sacks of grain. You don't know the name of it yet, but history will call it the Black Death, and you're right in the middle of it. Life, up until this point, has been filthy, but predictable. People smell bad, waste goes in the street, rats chew through the grain sacks, and nobody questions it because it's always been that way. But now, everything's falling apart. The streets are quiet except for coughing and crying, markets shut down, no one wants to touch anyone. Suddenly the question on everyone's cracked, fever-dry lips isn't, did you hear what happened to the miller's cow? It's, did you clean your house today? For the first time in your life, hygiene becomes important. Not because people understand disease, but because they're scared, terrified, desperate to make sense of the invisible killer sweeping through towns faster than gossip. You hear that it's caused by foul air, bad humours rising from the earth or carried on the wind. So people start cleaning, sort of. Not in the germ-killing, scrubbing until it shines kind of way, but in the throw some rosewater around and hope you live kind of way. Let's drop in a historical fact here. During the Black Death of the mid-14th century, many cities implemented early public health measures. Streets were cleaned more frequently. Laws were passed about disposing of the dead. Some towns banned people from gathering in groups. Venice even established a 40-day quarantine period for ships, giving us the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta meaning 40. It wasn't enough to stop the plague, but it was the first time in centuries that sanitation and public health were viewed as connected. Of course, most of it was chaos. People burned aromatic herbs to purify the air. They carried posies and pressed them to their noses when walking past sick houses, hence the eerie children's rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," which you now cannot unhear. Physicians wore those horrifying bird-like masks stuffed with lavender, mint and myrrh, believing the scent would keep the deadly vapours out of their lungs. That mask? It's terrifying, yes, but it's also a primitive air filter. Not effective, but creative. Meanwhile, others went the opposite direction entirely. Why bother cleaning when it's clearly God's punishment for sin? Flagellants, bands of wandering religious zealots, walk barefoot from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, hoping their blood will appease an angry deity. You watch them pass one afternoon, dust caking their torn backs, chanting in low Latin. You clutch your tunic tighter around your body and step back into your house, where you sprinkle dried rosemary along the windowsill like it's going to do anything. Now, for your fringe fact of the night, one group in Europe, oddly enough, did manage to avoid massive plague losses for a time, the Jews of Strasbourg. Why? Because many of them followed religious purity laws that involved frequent hand-washing, regular bathing, and separation of waste from living spaces. These practices likely slowed the spread of the disease in their communities. Tragically, this led to them being accused of causing the plague, resulting in horrific massacres and expulsions. Cleanliness, it turns out, was viewed with suspicion if it stood out too much. Back in your town, the fear gets weirder. People avoid meat or eat only bread dipped in vinegar. Some start bathing more frequently, soaking in vinegar or wine, even though it leaves their skin raw. Others stop bathing entirely, believing that water opens the pores and lets the disease in. You watch your neighbour boil her bedsheets, muttering prayers the whole time. Another neighbour fills her house with smoke from burning pine branches, coughing until she vomits. Everyone is doing something. No one agrees on what works, most of it doesn't. There's a scholarly debate still raging centuries later. Did the Black Death actually change medieval hygiene habits permanently? Or was it just a temporary panic? Some argue that public health reforms followed in the plague's wake. More latrines, better burial practices, improved water access. Others point out that once the fear faded, most people returned to old habits. After all, humans are good at forgetting, especially when the memory smells like rotting corpses and rosemary sachets. You, though, you change a little. You start washing your hands more often, even if it's just with rainwater. You sweep out your house. You hang herbs over the door, not because you believe in their power, but because doing something feels better than doing nothing. You avoid touching strangers. You boil your drinking water when you can. You check yourself in the mornings for lumps and lesions, holding your breath as your fingers press into the flesh, and death is everywhere. The priest collapses mid-sermon. The baker's wife dies in her sleep, her baby gone a day later. Graves fill up, bodies are buried in mass pits. You start seeing the gravediggers more than your friends. And always, there's the question, who will be next? You survive, this time. You're thin, tired, sunken-eyed, and you flinch at every cough. But you're alive. And something inside you has shifted. You don't trust the air anymore, or the people, or your body, but you've learnt that filth might not be harmless, that maybe, just maybe, what you touch, eat, or breathe matters. You spend the next few weeks with your windows open, herbs drying near the fire, and a bowl of rainwater on the table. It's a ritual, a comfort, maybe even the beginning of something resembling hygiene. Tomorrow, we'll take a closer look at how religion, belief, and ritual blended with cleanliness, and how holy water, pilgrim sweat, and blessed dust were all part of your medieval cleaning routine, whether they helped or not. You're standing in the nave of the village church, surrounded by the cool stillness of stone walls and the faint scent of beeswax and old incense. Light filters in through tiny stained glass windows, painting dusty rainbows on the flagstone floor. It's peaceful here. Cleaner than your cottage, certainly, and quieter than the market square. You dip your fingers into the holy water font by the door, make the sign of the cross across your chest, and for a moment you wonder, is this water actually doing anything? Because in the Middle Ages, holy water isn't just for prayer, it's also, in a roundabout way, your cleaning product. Blessed by a priest stored in a stone basin and renewed weekly, hopefully, it's used to cleanse you, but not in the modern soap and scrub sense. This is spiritual hygiene. You don't believe it washes your skin so much as it protects your soul and maybe, just maybe, wards off that ever-present sense of rot that clings to everything these days. This is the strange overlap between cleanliness and religion in your world. The lines blur constantly. Dirt on your hands might be just dirt or a sign of sin. A foul smell might mean something died nearby, or that the devil has slipped in through a cracked window, and so you clean what you can, not with soap and water, but with rituals, blessings, ash, smoke, salt. Historical fact incoming. The medieval church had a huge influence on personal and public hygiene, sometimes for better, sometimes for confusion. Monasteries, as you've seen, took hygiene seriously as part of their spiritual discipline. But for the average person, cleanliness was tied tightly to morality. Cleanliness of the body was good, sure, but only if it reflected the cleanliness of the soul. Too much focus on the flesh, on beauty or bathing, was seen as vanity, or worse, lust. You could rinse your hands for prayer, but scrubbing too hard might raise eyebrows. You finish your prayer and sit near the back on a bench that creaks with every shift of your weight. The woman beside you smells like lavender and sweat, a blend of crushed herbs and hard labour. She's probably rubbed a mixture of blessed oil and vinegar onto her skin before coming to church, not just to smell pleasant, but to protect herself. Because some people believe that holy objects and sacred substances can physically repel illness. Holy water sprinkled across your doorframe, salt kept in your shoes, or even dust collected from a saint's tomb mixed into wine. These are your disinfectants. And now for a particularly quirky fringe fact. Pilgrim sweat. Yes, pilgrim sweat. When holy people returned from long journeys to sacred sites, it was believed that the physical hardship they endured made them spiritually charged. In some areas, pilgrims would be asked to wring out their soaked garments, and the sweat collected or absorbed was considered healing. Not that anyone bottled it and sold it at market, well, not often. But the idea was clear. Holiness could be transferred, and the more bodily evidence you had, the better. You've never been on pilgrimage. It's expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. But you do what you can at home. You boil rosemary and sprinkle it on your floor. You wash your face with holy water before sleep. You hang crosses above your bed, partly for protection, partly because they're the only things that haven't fallen apart. You even keep a scrap of cloth in your pouch, a piece of someone's robe who claimed to have seen a miracle. You rub it between your fingers when your stomach turns or your skin flares up. You're not sure it helps, but it feels like it might. Now let's wander into the realm of scholarly debate. Was this kind of spiritual hygiene a substitute for real cleanliness? Or did people genuinely see no difference between the two? Some argue that the church actively discouraged physical bathing because it feared indulgence and vanity. Others claim that the church didn't oppose bathing itself, but rather the circumstances around it. Public nudity, co-ed bathhouses, or the association with sinful pleasure. There's also evidence that priests and monks bathed more regularly than they admitted, especially when they had access to clean water and private facilities. So like most things medieval, it's a bit of both. Rule in public, rinse in secret. And here's something else. Cleanliness rituals were often tied to the calendar. Before major feast days like Easter or Christmas, you made an effort to wash, both body and soul. Confession was expected, so was trimming your nails, washing your feet, and changing into your cleaner shift. If you were lucky, maybe you'd soak your feet in a basin while someone read a psalm aloud. You'd feel holy, even if your feet still smelled like boiled leather. As the church bells ring out again, signalling the end of the morning service, you rise and file out with the others. You pass the font again, dipping your fingers with automatic reverence, even though you know the water is cloudy and hasn't been changed since last Sunday. It doesn't matter. It's not about being sterile, a word you don't even know. It's about being right. About stacking the odds, just a little, in your favour. Outside, the air is thick with the scent of livestock and rain-soaked soil. You walk home slowly, fingers still damp, feeling strangely lighter. You've done nothing truly hygienic by modern standards. You haven't bathed. You haven't disinfected anything, but your house smells like rosemary and smoke. Your hands feel cleaner. Your heart feels a bit steadier. You arrive at your doorstep and sprinkle a pinch of salt on the threshold, as you do every Friday. Not because it makes sense, but because you've always done it. And in this world, where death waits in the wells and plagues slip in through the air, ritual is as close to hygiene as most people ever get. Tomorrow we're diving into the darker corners of medieval medicine, specifically the very creative, very alarming ways people use their own bodily fluids to heal the skin. Spoiler, you might want to eat after that episode. You wake up to a familiar sensation. Your face itches, your arms burn slightly under your sleeves, and the boil on your thigh is making an unwelcome comeback. It's not infected yet, but it's thinking about it. You sigh, roll over, and stare at the rafters. You know what this means. It's time to try something drastic. Something that makes you question everything you believe about dignity, healing, and why humans are allowed to invent things. Yes, it's time to pee in a cup. Welcome to medieval skincare, where bodily fluids aren't just waste, they're medicine. The logic is simple. What comes out of your body must have some connection to what's wrong with your body. Or alternatively, if you rub your own fluids back onto your skin, it's like your body recognizing itself and correcting the error. It's your internal balance on the outside, a closed-loop horror show. You sit up, grab the nearest clay cup, and prepare to do something that would get you quietly unfriended at every modern brunch table. Here's your historical fact of the day. Urine was widely used in medieval medicine and hygiene. Physicians and barbers alike relied on uroscopy, the examination of urine to diagnose illness. The colour, clarity, even the smell told them what was wrong with you. But it didn't stop there. Urine was also applied directly to wounds, used as a skin tonic, a mouth rinse, a laundry aid, and even mixed with herbs to create early antiseptics. It was believed to cleanse, dry out infection, and stimulate healing. In some households, especially those without access to herbs or lye, stale urine, yes, aged for several days, was the go-to disinfectant. Yes, you read that correctly, aged urine. The older the better. Once it turned into ammonia-heavy lant, it was considered even more effective for removing stains, dissolving grease, and treating skin conditions. It also smelled like your worst nightmare's breath, but priorities are different in your century. Today your plan is simple. You've collected yesterday's sample in a covered vessel, and after breakfast you apply it directly to the affected area using a strip of cloth. The skin tingles, then burns. You're not sure if that means it's working or if you've just created a new problem. You repeat the process on your elbows, which have been flaking like stale cheese for weeks now. You're not thrilled, but you're committed. Time for a fringe fact. Some beauty regimens, especially among wealthier women, also included urine-based treatments. One such remedy suggested mixing a woman's own morning urine with crushed rosemary and using it as a facial rinse to reduce blemishes and improve complexion. You'd massage it in gently, leave it for a moment, and rinse with rose water if you were fancy. If you were not fancy, well, just let the breeze dry it. Either way, the hope was clear skin, and the trade-off was smelling like a well-fed goat's bad day. Of course, this all sounds outrageous, until you consider the alternatives. Soap is rare and expensive, vinegar stings, honey attracts flies, oil makes you slick and shiny but does little for infection. And remember, you're living in a world where pus is seen as a healthy sign of healing, and where applying a dead pigeon to your chest is considered reasonable for respiratory issues. So when someone suggests peeing on your eczema, you don't laugh. You nod thoughtfully and ask how many times a day you should do it. And it's not just urine. Blood, sweat, breast milk, and even earwax were used in various treatments. Your own spit is a recognised remedy for eye infections. Yes, spit. You'd wake up, gather the first spit of the day, because apparently that's the purest one, and dab it gently into your eye. It doesn't work, nothing works, but you keep trying because someone's aunt swore it cured her cataract. Now here's where the scholars start arguing. Was all of this just superstition, or was there a method to the madness? Some historians suggest that using bodily fluids had symbolic importance, an extension of humoral theory and the desire to balance the body. Others point out that urine, especially aged urine, does have mild antiseptic properties due to ammonia content, so yes, it stank to high heaven, but in some cases it may have actually helped. The problem? No one knew which cases. So people just kept applying pee to everything. You've tried the salves, you've tried the herbs, today you try pee. Tomorrow maybe the old woman down the lane will convince you to smear ash and butter on the rash, or to bury an onion under your bed and wait for the illness to transfer. Honestly, at this point you'd rub dirt mixed with moonlight on your face if someone swore it worked. By midday your arms feel less raw, or maybe they're just numb. You smell faintly like a sheepfold, and the flies are unusually affectionate. But hey, there's no blood, no pus, and the boil hasn't gotten any bigger. You'll take it. You rinse your hands in the barrel and dry them on your tunic, trying not to think too hard about what's now absorbed into the fabric. Your face itches, but you resist the urge to scratch. The clay cup sits nearby. Ready for another round tomorrow. You've joined a long, illustrious tradition of medieval people treating themselves with themselves, and while it's deeply unglamorous, it's also kind of resourceful in a mildly terrifying way. Later that evening, you hear the neighbour's daughter shouting about her burned hand. She's spilled hot porridge and now her palm's blistering. Someone runs to the field for herbs, someone else suggests the priest. You, seasoned DIY healer that you are, offer her a urine compress. She looks horrified. You shrug. It worked for your thigh boil. Tomorrow we dive into medieval makeup because, believe it or not, even in a time of open sores and chamber pots, people still cared about looking hot. Too bad their makeup kits were basically poison with a bow on top. You're crouched by the fire, holding a shard of polished metal up to your face, trying to catch the light just right. It's the closest thing you have to a mirror, and today, despite the rash, the itch, the stench, and the undeniable presence of a boil that is slowly becoming part of your personality, you want to look good. Or, at least look better. Because tonight there's a festival, and word around the market is that the miller's son, who hasn't married yet and owns a pig, might be coming. That's right. Time for makeup. Medieval style. Now, makeup in your world is not exactly what modern people would recognise. There's no foundation matched to your skin tone, no waterproof mascara, no highlighters named after precious gems or weather patterns. What you have is creative chemistry. Alchemy meets aesthetics. A little bit of crushed lead here, a pinch of burnt almond there, and a healthy dose of please don't let this kill me. You gather your supplies, a chunk of white powder, a stub of coal, a pot of greenish salve you borrowed from a neighbour's cousin who swears it's for skin enhancement, not boils. You start with the face. In this time and place, pale skin is in. Tanned skin means labour, means you're poor, means you've been outside digging in muck. Pale skin, on the other hand, means leisure, wealth, nobility, being soft and fragile and closer to heaven than dirt. So naturally, you want to go pale. Not just light, but light enough to make people squint in sunlight. Historical fact incoming. Women and men, though less openly, used white lead-based powders on their faces to achieve that perfect ghostly glow. Venetian Carusse was the gold standard. It was made by mixing white lead with vinegar and leaving it to sit for days until it turned into a thick, creamy paste. It went on smooth, hid blemishes, and made your face as pale as a saint's statue. It also slowly destroyed your skin and poisoned your blood. But hey, at least you looked fabulous while dying. Of course, you don't have access to imported ceruse. What you've got is homemade, ground chalk, some crushed eggshell, and, if you're feeling wild, a bit of stale goat milk. You smear it on with your fingers, working it into your cheeks and forehead. The result is less noble beauty and more sad bread dough with eyes, but you're committed. Next, the eyebrows. Thin and high is the fashion among the elite, and you've plucked yours down to near invisibility over the years. Though with no tweezers, it's more like ripped out with a sewing needle. You darken the remaining hairs with soot mixed with a dab of fat, applied using a goose feather you trimmed into a crude brush. It smudges a little, but that just adds to the mystery, right? Now the lips. Red lips are tricky. On one hand, they're considered seductive. On the other, they might imply you've been drinking too much wine or consorting with the devil, same thing depending on who's preaching. But you want to take the risk. So you rub crushed beetroot across your mouth, which stains it an uneven reddish purple. If you're lucky, it'll last until after sunset. If not, it'll just look like you've been licking berries in the woods again. Fringe fact time. Some medieval cosmetics included ingredients like mercury, alum, and verdigris, a green patina scraped from copper. These were used to treat skin tone, remove blemishes, or tint the cheeks. Of course, all of them are wildly toxic. Mercury causes tremors, verdigris is corrosive, and alum dries your skin so badly it cracks like old leather. But they were considered cutting-edge beauty tools, passed down in whispered recipes and scribbled marginalia in herbal manuscripts. You skip the dangerous stuff, partly because you don't have it, partly because you saw what happened to the woman who used powdered arsenic to brighten her eyes. Spoiler, they closed permanently. But even without access to the heavy chemicals of the nobility, you manage a decent look. You powder down the shine from your nose with dried flour, blot your cheeks with rose petals for a hint of colour, and apply a faint line of charcoal along your lower lashes. It itches. You blink. You probably just gave yourself eye worms. Totally worth it. Now for the final touch, hair. Yours is stiff from smoke, wind, and weeks of neglect. You comb it out as best you can, rub a bit of rosemary oil, homemade of course, through the strands, and braid it loosely, tucking a few dried flower petals in for flair. It's not glamorous, it's not polished, but it's something. And in your village, that counts for a lot. Here's the scholarly debate. Did medieval people really go all out with cosmetics? Or is this just another myth inflated by later sources? Some say yes, especially in urban centres and among the upper classes, beauty culture was very much alive. Recipes for cosmetic treatments survive in medieval manuscripts, and portraits show stylised faces that clearly required effort. Others argue that the majority of people didn't have the time, resources, or desire to do much more than wash their faces in the river and maybe chew on mint leaves. Again, it comes down to class, access, and how close you live to someone who thinks arsenic blush is a fun idea. But tonight, none of that matters. You look into your mirror shard and smile, carefully, so you don't crack the lead powder crust on your cheeks. You step into the cooling air of early evening, tunic freshly brushed, scent of mint and goat still wafting faintly around you. The village square is lit with torches. There's music, laughter, the smell of roasting onions and muddy boots. Someone compliments your hair. Someone else asks if you're feeling alright. You're so pale. You take both as praise. Tomorrow, we're stepping out of the makeup zone and into something far grubbier. Shoes! Or more accurately, the fact that everyone's walking around tracking filth into every corner of your life, including your bed and your soup. You wake up to the sound of someone stomping across the cottage floor, hard, deliberate footsteps that shake dust from the rafters and send the chickens clucking in protest outside. It's your brother, of course, clomping around in his heavy leather shoes like he's trying to summon the devil. You squint at the floorboards and notice a fresh streak of something brown, sticky and unidentifiable near the hearth. You'd like to believe it's mud. You know it's not. Because in medieval life, shoes aren't just fashion or protection. They're portable disasters. Whatever's out in the street, waste, rot, spilled ale, horse droppings, rotting vegetables, actual corpses in plague years. It's all coming home with you, literally stuck to your soles. And you're not taking your shoes off before entering, because that's not a thing here. This is not a no shoes inside culture. This is a hope nothing squelches when you step culture. You glance down at your own footwear. If you're lucky, you own a pair of turn shoes, soft leather constructions that resemble something between a slipper and a flattened burrito. If not, you're barefoot, or you wear wooden clogs tied with scraps of fabric. Either way, the sole is thin and the structure is loose, and the protection from the outside world is theoretical. Whatever's on the ground makes it in, and that includes everything from animal dung to spoiled blood from the butcher's stall. Welcome to the medieval shoe experience. 2 centimetres of cowhide between your toes and cholera. Here's a historical fact for you. Many medieval towns eventually instituted pavement laws or cleanliness ordinances, attempting to manage what was being tracked into homes and public buildings. In cities like London, Paris and Florence, street cleaners, called rakers or scavenge men, were employed to remove refuse and animal waste, particularly from markets and narrow alleys. In some places, people were fined for dumping slop outside their doors, or failing to keep their threshold clean. These were early attempts at sanitation, but the problem wasn't just what was in the street, it was what walked out of it on your feet. You try scrubbing the floor with a broom made from bundled twigs. It moves the dirt around, that's about it. You splash a bit of stale beer on the stone threshold to disinfect it, an old village trick passed down from someone's grandmother who once survived a particularly nasty rash. Then you rub down the boards with a vinegar-soaked rag. The smell is aggressive, but not as aggressive as the smear your brother just left from the tannery path. Fringe fact time. In wealthier homes, it was common to lay down rushes or woven grasses across the floor. These rushes weren't just decorative, they acted as a sort of medieval carpet. Sounds lovely, right? Except they weren't changed very often. Layers of food scraps, animal hair, dirt, human moral waste and other debris would accumulate under the rushes, pressed down into a mulch-like stew that fermented slowly in the shadows. People sometimes added sweet-smelling herbs to mask the odour. Think of it as potpourri over a compost pile. In monasteries and some castles, rushes were replaced more regularly, perhaps once a season or during important holidays. In the average village home, they might go unchanged for months. That means whatever came in on your shoes simply joined the grand layering project underfoot. It's less cleaning and more strategic burying. The scholarly debate here is spicy. Some argue that medieval people were disgustingly indifferent to the state of their floors and shoes, letting filth pile up to levels we'd find unimaginable. Others claim that we underestimate their standards, that cleanliness was relative, and people did what they could with the tools they had. After all, they swept, laid rushes, hung herbs, and tried to keep animals outside, when possible. But when your livestock, family, and food storage all live in the same one-room cottage, cleanliness is more of a moral victory than a visual one. You scrape something off your shoe using the edge of the hearthstone and grimace. You're not going to ask what it was. Instead, you reach for a linen cloth and try wiping your soles as clean as possible, an effort that would be more effective if your cloth weren't already the colour of despair. Later, when the sun warms the outside stone, you'll leave your shoes there to air out. In theory, in practice the dog will probably run off with one, and you'll spend an hour chasing him across the field with a wooden spoon. You make a mental note to scold your brother for stomping around like a one-man manure parade. Then you remember the time you walked into the house with pond mud up to your calves and said nothing. Because this is just how things are. You clean what you can, ignore the rest, and hope the fire dries out the worst of the damp. Speaking of the fire, that's another unintentional cleaning tool. Smoke fills the room constantly, especially in winter. It drives away flies, dries out damp surfaces, and coats everything in a layer of soot that somehow feels cleaner than what's underneath. It's a grim irony. Your house is filthy, but the layer of ash makes it feel homey, cozy, like being tucked under a dirty wool blanket that smells faintly of bacon grease and comfort. At night, you sleep with your shoes nearby, never too far in case of fire or a midnight emergency. Sometimes you use them to block a draft in the door, sometimes they're full of spiders. You shake them out in the morning, not because you're squeamish, but because waking up with a centipede in your boot ruins the whole day. Tomorrow we're going to dig even deeper into medieval madness, specifically the terrifying fact that doctors didn't wash their hands, ever. So when they sliced you open or popped your boil, they brought the whole filthy world with them, right into your bloodstream. You've been coughing for 3 days now, not the occasional tickle, not the polite kind you can pass off as just some dust. This is a deep, wet, rib-bruising kind of cough. Your breath rattles when you lie down. There's a burn behind your eyes. And now someone has decided you need to see a doctor. Not the village wise woman, not the monk with his soothing salves and minty teas. No, a physician. One of the big league, Latin-speaking, gold chain-wearing experts from the nearest town. The kind of man who shows up with books, confidence, and zero intention of washing his hands. He arrives on horseback in robes that once were expensive but now look travel-worn and streaked with mystery fluids. His assistant, a boy who hasn't smiled once, unloads a leather case that smells like mould and melted candle wax. Inside are blades, syringes, bowls, and tools that look better suited for carving roast meat than healing humans. The doctor asks you questions while flipping through a handwritten text full of contradictory advice. He never once touches water, not to clean his hands, not to clean his instruments, not even to rinse the smell of sweat and dried herbs from his beard. Because here's the ugly truth of medieval medicine. Doctors didn't wash their hands. They didn't scrub their tools. They didn't boil their linens or sterilize their blades. And why would they? Germ theory won't exist for another 500 years. Disease, as far as they know, is caused by imbalanced humours, foul air, sinful thoughts, or maybe a vengeful star blinking the wrong way over Italy. Your pus-filled sore has nothing to do with bacteria. It's simply a sign that your body is too full of bad stuff and needs to be emptied. Historical fact. Physicians in the Middle Ages were more philosophers than practitioners. They studied Galen and Hippocrates, obsessed over bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and made charts mapping illnesses to astrology. Hands-on work like cutting, stitching, or applying poultices was often beneath them. That was left to barber-surgeons or midwives. Physicians, they prescribed bleeding, issued dietary advice, and diagnosed you from a distance, sometimes without even looking at you, especially if you looked contagious. but this one does examine you after shoving his unwashed fingers into your mouth and prying it open. He sniffs your breath like a sommelier evaluating cheap wine and declares your humours damp and corrupted. He flips to a page in his book that includes a helpful drawing of a man with frogs in his lungs. You try not to panic. He prescribes bloodletting, of course. Everyone always prescribes bloodletting. It's the go-to cure for nearly everything. Fevers, headaches, melancholy, acne, heartbreak. You're too full of blood, apparently, and need less of it. So he selects a thin, curved blade from his his kit, wiped briefly on the hem of his robe, and makes a small slice in your arm. The blood comes fast, dark. He watches it drip into a bowl with the sort of interest normally reserved for cooking meat. You ask if he's going to clean the wound. He looks confused by the question. Now for a fringe fact that will haunt your dreams. Some physicians believe the smell of a wound indicated whether it was healing properly. They'd sniff the pus, compare it to descriptions in their books. Sweet, bitter, meaty, putrid, and make adjustments accordingly. They didn't clean the area so much as wait for the smell to change. If it got worse, they might add some herbs. Or a leech. Leeches, by the way, are still in style. The doctor doesn't have any with him today, but he casually suggests you find some in the river and apply them to your temples in the evening. They help balance the energies, he says. As though you're not actively bleeding into a crusty bowl. You nod. You're not going to do it, but he's the one with the book. The assistant rewraps your arm with a cloth that smells like old shoes, and you're told to avoid hot food and strong emotions for 3 days. You're also advised to hang a dead mole in the doorway to keep out plague vapours. You don't argue. You're too lightheaded from blood loss. Now here's the scholarly debate. Were medieval doctors total quacks, or just limited by the science of their time? Some historians argue that physicians did the best they could with what they had, and that not washing hands wasn't negligence, it was just ignorance. Others point to the stubbornness of the medical establishment, which clung to outdated theories for centuries despite evidence to the contrary. Arabic and Persian medical texts, for example, included cleaning wounds with wine and boiling tools, a practice that European medicine mostly ignored until much later. Why? Because the European system was obsessed with tradition and terrified of being wrong, and the result? People died. Not just from illness, but from the cures, surgery without washing, injections with dirty needles, open wounds stuffed with mouldy bread and bound in rags that hadn't been laundered since the last plague. No one's counting bacteria. They're counting bleeding days and praying the moon doesn't shift into Aries. By the time the doctor leaves, you feel worse. Your cough is deeper. Your head is full of fuzz. Your arm is swollen where the cut refuses to close. But the physician got paid in coin, eggs, or the promise of future flour, and he rides off with the smug expression of someone who's just saved a life. You lie back down, blanket pulled up to your chin, and stare at the ceiling wondering if your fever dreams will involve frogs in your lungs. Tomorrow we dive into one of the most charmingly wrong medical beliefs of the era. Toothworms. Yes, medieval people thought the pain in your jaw came from tiny creatures chewing their way through your teeth. And honestly, compared to the alternative, it kind of makes sense. You bite down hard on a strip of leather, feeling the sharp ache in your molar radiate through your skull like a tiny army of hammers. You're sitting in the corner of your one-room cottage, holding your jaw with both hands because there's nowhere else to go. And yes, your neighbour's son is standing over you with an iron pick, muttering about removing the worm. Welcome to medieval dentistry, where cavities are explained by literal worms living inside your teeth, and pain is solved with brute force, prayer, and a pinch of luck. To medieval people, toothaches weren't a result of decay or bacteria. Oh no. According to the best physicians of the time, the problem was real creatures gnawing away at your enamel, burrowing into the pulp and causing misery. Toothworms were described in medical texts across Europe, from Paris to Prague, often with diagrams showing squiggly little monsters wriggling happily inside a molar. You aren't sure if it's comforting or terrifying, but either way the treatment is immediate. Removal, destruction, or incantation. Historical fact, before the advent of modern dentistry, remedies for tooth pain ranged from chewing herbs like rue or cloves to surgical extraction by barber-surgeons. They used tools ranging from iron forceps to heated pokers, and anaesthesia was mostly optional. Sometimes people would fill cavities with molten lead or gold, thinking it would kill the worm or preserve the tooth. Unsurprisingly, this often caused more harm than good, yet somehow people survived and occasionally kept a few teeth. And yes, there's a fringe fact that makes your toes curl. In some areas, people believed that simply looking at a worm or a strange object would cause the worm in your tooth to die. A handful of medieval remedies instructed you to make offerings to the worm, recite chants, or pass a charm over your jaw while praying. Some even suggested that the worm could be expelled by applying strong-tasting substances like onions, garlic, or vinegar to the offending tooth. You consider yourself lucky to have vinegar, though your breath has already become its own form of chemical warfare. The procedure begins. Your neighbour grips your head with one hand while your jaw is forced open. The iron pick is pressed against the offending molar. You bite down, grit your teeth, and scream softly to preserve your dignity. Snap. Pop. You taste iron. You taste blood. You pray that the tooth comes out whole, or at least with the worm still inside, if such a thing exists. The tool slips, scraping the gum. Tears prick your eyes. A bead of sweat runs down your temple. You're alive. That counts as a victory. Scholars still debate whether the toothworm theory was taken literally by everyone. Some argue it was more metaphorical, a convenient way to explain pain that no one could otherwise diagnose. Others insist that literal belief persisted for centuries, affecting diet, oral hygiene, and treatment practices. Either way, it shaped behaviour. Chewing medicinal herbs, rubbing garlic on teeth, and avoiding sweet things in fear of feeding the worm. Your ancestors were paranoid about candy before candy even existed. And what about prevention? That was even more creative. People chewed on mint, rosemary, or cloves to cleanse the teeth and keep worms away. They rinsed with vinegar or wine. Some even carried charms or amulets that were supposed to protect their teeth spiritually. If all else failed, you pulled the tooth. Not gently, not surgically, but quickly, violently, and with a prayer. The pain is gone. The tooth is on the table beside you, grey, battered, and vaguely triumphant. You can't tell if it's relieved, angry, or harbouring a last tiny worm. Your jaw aches, your lips are swollen, and your mouth tastes of blood and iron. But it's free, at least until the next cavity develops. Until then, your remaining teeth feel heroic, though slightly haunted. You spit gingerly into a bowl, wipe your hands on your tunic, and wonder if anyone else survived this treatment with all their sanity intact. Tomorrow we're exploring smells again, but this time with a focus on why medieval people were obsessed with odours as a form of medical and social signalling. Spoiler, bad smells were scary, but sometimes they were also your secret weapon. You step outside into the morning air, taking a deep breath and immediately regretting it. The village smells like a living compost heap. Fermented cabbage, damp wool, pig slop and yesterday's firewood, all rolled into one pungent cloud that clings to your nostrils like a persistent warning. This isn't just unpleasant. In medieval Europe, smells weren't trivial. They were deeply tied to health. People believed that foul odours, miasmas, carried disease and evil spirits. So while today we cover our noses for comfort, back then a stench could mean danger, death, or divine wrath. You pinch a sprig of lavender between your fingers, holding it to your nose, and continue down the cobbled street. Merchants are setting up stalls, children are darting around barefoot, and every so often someone mutters about the plague lurking in the air. In this world, smell is both a warning and a tool. You learn to read it. If the baker's stall reeks of spoiled meat, you step around it. If the tanner's yard hits your nose first, you know the leather processing is in full swing, and it's best to hold your breath. Smell is survival. Historical fact: the miasma theory dominated medieval medicine. People believed that diseases such as the plague, cholera, or fevers spread through bad air, particularly around decomposing matter. This led to bizarre preventive measures: carrying herbs, wearing pomanders filled with fragrant substances, or hanging aromatic cloths in doorways. Physicians and the public alike considered strong scents protective, even medicinal. So when you dab rosewater behind your ears or tuck sage into your tunic, you're not just masking odour, you're fighting potential illness with every breath. Fringe fact time. Some people took this obsession with smell even further. Wealthy households sometimes had a scent room filled with burning herbs, incense, and perfumed fabrics, where family members could retreat for a few moments of purified air. In extreme cases, sick individuals were carried through public streets in aromatic procession, hoping the blend of rosemary, thyme, and frankincense would prevent contagion. Basically, medieval aromatherapy meets emergency quarantine. You notice how these beliefs shape behaviour socially. People avoid each other. Touch is limited. Breathing the wrong air is risky. You carry your own protective sachets wherever you go. A friend approaches and greets you from a few feet away. The ritual is subtle. Nod, slight bow. Sniff discreetly and continue. You've learned the unspoken rules of smell-based etiquette. Offending someone's olfactory sensibilities could be as dangerous socially as stepping in their waste could be physically. Scholars debate how effective these practices were. Obviously, covering yourself in herbs didn't stop plague-bearing fleas or bacteria. Yet there's an argument that some behavioural changes, like keeping people apart, avoiding certain crowded spaces, or cleaning streets, actually did slow disease spread. So the obsession with smell might have been more useful than people realised, even if their understanding of why it worked was entirely wrong. Back at the market, you notice an elderly woman shaking a bundle of dried flowers at anyone who comes too close. You step aside and she mutters a prayer. Nearby, a butcher throws sawdust onto his cutting table, presumably to absorb blood and mask the smell. You make mental notes. This is hygiene according to survival logic. Not comfort, not beauty, not even moral cleanliness. Just raw, functional prevention. And yet smell has social meaning beyond health. A sweet or neutral odour signals respectability, wealth, or good health. A foul odour might indicate poverty, illness, or moral failing. You see people scrutinising one another subtly, by nose, not eye, deciding who to trust, who to avoid, and who might carry invisible threats. It's a social X-ray of the village, powered and entirely by scent. You navigate it carefully, clutching your sachet and feeling oddly empowered by your little bundle of rosemary, sage, and rose petals. By sunset, your tunic and shift smell faintly of herbs, though the street air has layered it with everything else. You take a moment to inhale deeply, appreciating how your small efforts protect you in ways more nuanced than you can articulate. In a world without soap, deodorant, or germ theory, your nose is your guide, your guardian, and sometimes your judge. And tonight, it's telling you that you survived another day, one sniff at a time. Tomorrow, we meet some of history's dirtiest celebrities, from kings to saints, and explore how even the rich and revered couldn't escape the universal human problem of stench. You hear it before you see it. A commotion in the market square as someone argues loudly about a missing goat. Then you spot him. A lordly figure in the velvet and fur, red face flushed, clearly unaccustomed to lifting a hand for anything other than signing decrees. You realise that even the elite, despite their silk-scented oils and imported spices, are not immune to medieval filth. Dirt doesn't discriminate. Wealth doesn't disinfect. Kings, queens and saints alike had to live with body odours, lice, and the same rats that gnawed your village granary. Social rank might improve comfort, but it didn't buy cleanliness. The rich often had attendants, valets, servants, laundresses, whose jobs were to make them presentable. But even that couldn't overcome centuries of ingrained habits and environmental realities. Nobles wore multiple layers of heavy fabric, which trapped sweat and skin oils. They travelled in open carriages, jostled by dust and road debris. Baths existed, sometimes lavishly appointed, but they were infrequent and public bathhouses carried scandalous reputations. A king could pay for rosewater and perfumed oils, but he still carried the same bacteria, fleas and stench as his serfs. No royal edict could change that. Historical fact: Richard III reportedly bathed only twice a year. Elizabeth I, known for her elaborate gowns and makeup, suffered from lice infestations like everyone else. Even saints, whose lives were idealised for holiness, endured basic human grime. St. Anthony of Padua, for instance, spent long hours in prayer, often in poor housing or open fields, leaving him susceptible to lice and skin infections. So if you think aristocracy meant odour-free, think again. Fringe fact: Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was famous for his fragrance obsession. He bathed rarely, but applied massive amounts of perfume to cover natural scents. Court etiquette dictated that courtiers maintain a delicate balance of scent so as not to offend. Despite all that perfume, there are reports of strong body odour at Versailles. Money, attention and power didn't create hygiene. They created a potent mask of it. Socially, odour became a form of currency. A foul smell could suggest low birth, illness, or moral failing. A pleasant scent implied wealth, propriety, or divine favour. Even saints had to navigate this. Relics and holy clothing were often washed or perfumed to maintain their aura of sanctity, and pilgrimage sites would sometimes supply scented oils to ensure visitors didn't leave smelling like the medieval equivalent of a barn. Smell was a signal, a warning and a tool, wielded as much as wealth or speech. Scholars debate just how pervasive hygiene gaps were among the elite. Some argue that wealthier classes had routines and tools that drastically improved cleanliness compared to peasants, particularly in cities with access to baths, laundries, and servants. Others counter that even luxury items couldn't overcome basic human biology and environmental factors. Evidence shows that lice, fleas, and body odour were universal. Clothing, beds, and even crowns harboured the same microbes as any peasant dwelling. You can be rich but not immune. You stroll past a noble's entourage, noting the subtle fragrance of rose and cinnamon mingling with a faint underlying musk. It's the olfactory equivalent of a royal announcement. I am wealthy, I am important, and I have at least attempted cleanliness. Nearby, a monk sweeps the square with a twig broom, trying to keep dust and filth at bay. And you, Marl, carrying your herbal sachet, understand the unspoken hierarchy of scent. Those who can mask it have status. Those who cannot survive by invisibility and caution. Even the infamous and revered were human. Charlemagne reportedly bathed frequently, but he still faced lice infestations. Nobles like King Edward III suffered from the same dental woes as you did last week. Saints' skin could flare with eczema or boils, and their hair could harbour vermin, despite prayers and rituals. Hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't about sport as choice, it was about access, knowledge, and sheer fortune, and even then it was unreliable. By sunset, the marketplace quiets, and the scents blend into one complex cloud. Sweet, sour, metallic, herbal. You breathe it in, adapting, understanding, and surviving. No one is immune to dirt, odour, or the microcosm of life crawling unseen in every fold of fabric. The lesson is clear: everyone is filthy, everyone is vulnerable, and even the most illustrious names in history could not escape the basic reality of human biology. Tomorrow we meet vermin, rats, fleas, and the hidden allies of filth who thrived in medieval hygiene chaos, and explore just how much they shaped survival, disease, and daily life. You're crouched near the granary, trying to pry a crust of bread from a mouldy loaf when you hear it. The soft scuttling sound of tiny feet against the wood. Rats, dozens of them darting along beams and piles of grain, whiskers twitching, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They're everywhere. You try not to breathe too deeply, but it's useless. The air is alive with the faint, musky scent of vermin. Welcome to medieval pest control, or the lack thereof. These little creatures are everywhere, thriving in homes, barns, and markets alike, and they're not just a nuisance, they're carriers. A silent army of fleas and microbes that made even the most careful hygiene efforts feel futile. Rats, of course, have always been around, but in the Middle Ages, they were more than just pests. They ate your grain, gnawed through wooden beams, and sometimes even chewed on bedding or clothing. They were intelligent, quick, and nearly impossible to eradicate. And the fleas they carried? That's another story entirely. Fleas thrive on rats, and those fleas occasionally jump to humans. Sometimes they carried diseases like the plague, meaning that these little animals were central to medieval epidemiology, whether anyone realised it or not. Historical fact, the Black Death of the 14th century is now widely believed to have been transmitted via fleas carried by black rats. These rodents lived in close proximity to human dwellings, particularly in towns and cities, where waste, grain stores, and human activity created ideal conditions. Fleas didn't discriminate. They bit humans when rats were unavailable, serving as vectors for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. Rats were essentially the perfect plague incubators. Fringe fact: some medieval remedies for rat infestations were highly imaginative. People employed cats, ferrets, and even terriers to hunt them down. Others resorted to poisons, arsenic, hemlock, or mixtures of fat and quicklime, often with mixed success. In some coastal towns, rats were believed to be agents of evil, and charms or amulets were hung in granaries to ward them off. Obviously, the rats didn't care about magic, but the villagers clung to hope. You've developed a routine to coexist with them. Sweep grain spills immediately, avoid leaving scraps on the floor, and check for gnawed edges on wooden beams. When you sleep, you build small barricades around your bedding, hoping to prevent nocturnal rat raids. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you wake to find a tail flicking against your straw mattress. Adaptation becomes second nature. Fear and vigilance are constant companions. Scholars debate the impact of rats on everyday life in medieval towns. Some argue that infestation shaped architecture. Granaries elevated on posts, homes with raised flooring, and storage practices designed to minimize contact with vermin. Others suggest that despite these efforts, rats were so prevalent that humans simply normalized their presence. Coexistence, not eradication, became the rule. Vermin were a part of life, tolerated as an inevitable nuisance. And it's not just rats. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrive in tandem. Your bedding, especially straw-filled mattresses, is prime territory. Even the cleanest household can harbour these pests. Flea bites itch and swell. Lice infest hair and clothing. Bedbugs leave marks in rows across skin. You wake at night scratching, sometimes flinging a shoe at the offending creature, only to realise you've missed the entire colony. Prevention is constant. Vigilance is survival. You've noticed how these creatures shape behaviour socially as well. Houses with severe infestations are often avoided. Guests bring their own caution. Children learn early to check for vermin before embracing a sibling or friend. Clothes are aired and washed when possible to reduce host surfaces. In extreme cases, people abandon homes temporarily to escape vermin outbreaks. Life and hygiene are inseparable from the tiny predators living among you. By the end of the day, the granary is relatively secure. Your bread crusts are untouched, and the scuttling has quieted. But you know the rats are waiting, biding their time for darkness. You can clean floors, sprinkle herbs, and shake out bedding. But in a medieval world, vermin will always find a way in. Acceptance, adaptation, and constant awareness become part of your definition of cleanliness. Tomorrow we explore one of the most personal and unavoidably intimate aspects of hygiene. Hair and scalp care beyond lice, including the strange rituals and tools people use to maintain it in a world without modern shampoo. You wake up with a headache and a tingling scalp that's not just from yesterday's scratchings, it's from weeks of neglect, sweat, dust, and yes, lice. Today you decide it's time to focus on hair. Not just brushing for aesthetics, not just lice removal, but true medieval scalp maintenance, the kind that borders on ritual and sometimes ventures into downright bizarre. You gather your tools, a carved wooden comb, a small clay pot of herbal oil, and a handful of dried rosemary from your windowsill. Your goal is simple: clean your scalp enough to prevent itching, look presentable for the market, and survive the judgmental gazes of neighbours. Hair care in the Middle Ages is a delicate balancing act. Washing with water is possible, but not daily. Hot water is expensive to produce and cold water is, well, shocking. So most people rely on dry cleaning methods: combing, brushing, dusting with herbs, and occasionally rubbing in oils to keep hair pliable. You run your comb slowly through the strands, detangling debris while listening for the tiny clicking of remaining lice. It's tedious work, but repetition brings calm. The ritual is meditative or almost soothing, if you ignore the occasional sting of a pinch. Historical fact: medieval texts emphasize the use of herbal oils and scented powders to maintain healthy hair. Rosemary, lavender, sage, and chamomile were common. Applied correctly, they conditioned the hair, masked odours, and helped repel vermin. Some wealthier households had elaborate hair care kits, with containers for powders, oils, and even rudimentary curling tools. For most peasants, a simple wooden comb and a handful of crushed herbs sufficed. Appearance was as much about social signalling as it was about personal comfort. Fringe fact: some people believed that applying human or animal fat to the scalp could strengthen hair and even cure baldness. Goose fat was a favourite among women, sometimes mixed with crushed herbs or honey. Men occasionally rubbed mutton fat into their locks. The resulting smell? Awful. But according to law, a stinky head was preferable to weak or falling hair. You decide against it. Scalp care also overlaps with superstition. You rub rosemary along your hairline, whispering a small prayer against evil worms and itching demons. Protective rituals are common. People believed that certain plants and oils could safeguard against lice, hair loss, and disease. In monasteries, monks sometimes washed their hair weekly, combining bathing with prayer, while the rest of the population relied on herbal infusions and diligent combing. Hair isn't just beauty, it's a line of defense. Scholars debate how effective these practices actually were. On one hand, herbs like rosemary and lavender contain mild antiseptics and insect-repelling compounds. On the other hand, lice and fleas persisted, thriving in unwashed fabrics and bedding. Medieval hair care was as much psychological as practical. The act of caring for your hair signalled diligence, morality, and status, regardless of whether the lice left. You finish combing, running the wooden tool through every inch, and apply a dab of rosemary oil to the scalp. The scent is strong but comforting. You braid your hair loosely to prevent tangling and tuck the ends into a scarf. Your head feels lighter. Your scalp is less itchy. You even dare to admire the slight shine in the sunlight. It's temporary, but it counts. By evening, you check the children's heads, ensuring combs are shared cautiously and herbs sprinkled strategically. Fleas and lice are still there, of course, but you've gained a small victory over the chaos. You lie down under your straw mattress, the scent of rosemary mingling with smoke, ash, and the faint tang of yesterday's meals. Survival in a world without modern shampoo feels like a minor miracle. Tomorrow we tackle the final frontier, the interplay of dirt, disease, and daily rituals, and how medieval people came to normalise a lifestyle that modern noses and skin would find unbearable. You wake up to the soft, damp smell of morning mist seeping through the cracks of your cottage walls, mingling with the lingering aroma of yesterday's herbs, sweat, smoke, and the faint tang of dried blood. It's the perfect moment to reflect on a life lived in filth, a filth so ordinary it barely registers anymore. Dirt, grime, lice, vermin, odours and bodily excretions are your constant companions, stitched seamlessly into the fabric of daily survival. You sweep a bit of straw from the floor, toss some water over the threshold and inhale deeply. This is normal, this is home, this is how people lived, how they survived, and how they made peace with the omnipresent, unavoidable chaos of medieval hygiene. From your morning routine to your interactions with neighbours, every action is shaped by the realities of dirt and disease. You wash when you can, scrub when possible, and pray when you must. Herbs and vinegar are your disinfectants. Smoke, salt, and ritual are your talismans. The barber-surgeon, the physician, the monks, the priest, even the rich and revered, all participate in this strange ballet of survival. They are human, fallible, sometimes terrifyingly creative, and often more resourceful than you'd expect. And yet, despite the absence of modern science, soap, or plumbing, they manage somehow to live, to work, to eat, and occasionally to thrive. Historical fact: the average medieval peasant survived on a mixture of luck, observation, and communal knowledge. Public health was rudimentary but present. Town ordinances attempted to regulate waste disposal. Monasteries and castles offered clean water and structured routines. Markets, herbs, and dietary customs all intersected with hygiene practices in complex ways. None of it was perfect, and mortality rates were high, but people learned to adapt. What looks like filth to us was a functional system of survival, negotiated daily between the living and the unseen, microscopic and spiritual threats of their world. Fringe fact, even saints, nobles and kings navigated this realm of hygiene precariously. Wealth and status offered temporary reprieve, better access to herbs, running water, perfumed oils and servants, but could not fully insulate anyone from lice, fleas, dysentery or the plague. In some cases, elaborate rituals of cleansing and perfuming were as much psychological armour as practical hygiene, designed to provide confidence and social authority in the face of universal decay. Scholarly debate persists. Were medieval people neglectful and filthy, or were they adaptive and pragmatic? Evidence suggests a combination. Relative to their environment, many were innovative in using herbs, ashes, vinegar, and behavioural strategies to manage the omnipresent challenges of dirt, vermin, and disease. Yet they lacked knowledge of germ theory, meaning much effort was symbolic, ritualistic, or only partially effective. Modern observers judge by contemporary standards, but for those living in the period, surviving another day was the measure of success. By mid-afternoon, you move through your routines with practiced ease. You tend the animals, check the midden, comb the children's hair, sweep floors, and inspect the doorways for vermin. You carry your sachets of rosemary, your clay pots of herbal ointments, your wooden combs and makeshift tools. Each act is a tiny negotiation with filth and disease. You've grown accustomed to smells, textures, and the constant presence of living pests. What seems unbearable from a modern perspective is merely ordinary survival in your world. You pause at the doorway, inhaling the mingling scents of the village: smoke, wet straw, roasted onions, wood, and the faint undertone of human and animal presence. You smile faintly. You're alive, you have adapted, and you have learned to navigate a universe where hygiene is a daily challenge, a spiritual undertaking and a practical necessity all at once. Your skin itches, your teeth ache, your hair tangles, and yet you endure. This is medieval life, Resilient, adaptive, and surprisingly ingenious in the face of pervasive dirt and disease. With the sun lowering toward the horizon, you settle down for the night. Straw beneath you, herbs nearby, clothes slightly fragrant and slightly damp. The world outside continues its messy, beautiful chaos. Tomorrow is another day of survival, of negotiating filth, and of finding comfort in small routines that keep you alive in a world that would make modern sensibilities faint. For now, you close your eyes, letting the smells, textures, and rhythms of your life lull you into a well-earned rest.